Within milliseconds of a nuclear explosion, the human body faces forces so devastating that temperatures reach 100 million degrees Celsius, hotter than the center of the sun. At ground zero, people simply cease to exist as matter, transformed into constituent atoms before nerve impulses can even register what is happening. Yet beyond this zone of instant vaporization lies a more complex story of how human biology confronts the raw power of the atom. Tonight we explore what happens when atomic fire meets human flesh, a sobering intersection of physics and medicine that reveals both our extraordinary vulnerability and surprising resilience. The thermal flash that creates third degree burns 20 miles away, the blast waves that rupture internal organs, the invisible radiation that rewrites our cellular programming, each represents a different chapter in understanding how our bodies respond to forces they were never designed to withstand. These discoveries emerge from studying the Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors whose experiences continue to inform medical science decades later. We will journey through the precise timeline of destruction as thermal radiation sears exposed skin in seconds, examine how blast pressures measured in tons per square inch affect human tissue, and discover why some people survived conditions that should have been instantly fatal. Each revelation builds toward understanding how nuclear weapons attack the very chemistry of life, while simultaneously revealing the remarkable protective mechanisms hidden within our cells. Hello fellow curious minds, and welcome back to The Calm Scientist. I hope you're settling in comfortably for tonight's exploration, perhaps with a warm drink and a cozy blanket. I should warn you though, what we're about to discover might be too fascinating for sleep and certainly too sobering to ignore. The science of nuclear weapons effects contains truths so profound that your mind may be too busy processing to drift off peacefully. If you find yourself genuinely enjoying this journey through the extremes of human survival, I would be grateful if you liked and subscribed to help other curious minds discover these important stories. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, and the weirdest dream you have ever had. There is something meaningful about knowing that right now, all around the world, people are learning together about the most serious challenges our species has created for itself. Tonight, we will explore 4 interconnected ways that extreme conditions test the limits of human biology, from the instant devastation of atomic fire to the slow burn of cellular adaptation. Our first stop takes us into the moment of detonation, where we will witness what happens when the human body encounters forces beyond anything evolution prepared it to face. In the span of milliseconds, everything changes. A nuclear explosion unleashes forces so devastating that the human body, built from billions of years of evolution, faces destruction beyond anything it was designed to withstand. To understand what happens when atomic fire meets human flesh is to peer into one of the most sobering chapters of physics and medicine, where the delicate chemistry of life confronts the raw power of the atom. Picture the moment of detonation. At the heart of a nuclear explosion, temperatures instantly reach 100 million degrees Celsius, hotter than the center of the sun. The air itself becomes plasma, a fourth state of matter where electrons are stripped from atoms and matter exists as charged particles. This fireball expands faster than the human mind can process, growing from a point to hundreds of meters across in the first second alone. Within the first few hundred meters of ground zero, the intense thermal radiation vaporizes everything instantly. Human bodies simply cease to exist as matter, transformed into constituent atoms that become part of the expanding fireball. There is no time for pain, no moment of awareness. The transformation happens faster than nerve impulses can travel, faster than the brain can register what is occurring. In these closest zones, people become shadows, literally imprinted on walls and concrete surfaces as their bodies absorb and block the intense light for the briefest of moments before becoming part of the plasma itself. But this zone of instant vaporization extends only a few hundred meters. Beyond this distance, the human body faces a cascade of destruction that unfolds over seconds, minutes, and decades. The story becomes one of thermal radiation, blast waves, and ionizing radiation, each delivering its own unique form of devastation to the intricate biological systems that sustain life. The thermal flash arrives first, traveling at the speed of light. This intense burst of infrared radiation carries more energy per square centimeter than the surface of the sun delivers to Earth over an entire day. The flash lasts only seconds, but those seconds are enough to ignite clothing, incinerate exposed skin, and burn patterns into flesh wherever dark fabric has absorbed more heat than light-coloured materials. Survivors describe the moment as being touched by the heat of a giant furnace. The thermal radiation penetrates only the outer layers of skin, but the damage is immediate and profound. First-degree burns appear on exposed flesh, up to 20 miles from a large thermonuclear explosion. These burns resemble severe sunburn, causing redness, swelling, and pain as blood vessels dilate and fluid accumulates in tissues. Closer to the explosion, second-degree burns destroy both the outer layer of skin and the underlying dermis. Blisters form as fluid accumulates between layers of damaged tissue. The body's natural healing mechanisms struggle to cope as vast areas of skin lose their protective barrier function. Pain becomes excruciating as exposed nerve endings signal damage throughout the body. Third-degree burns, occurring closer still to the blast, destroy the full thickness of skin and often underlying tissues. The burned areas appear white or charred black, paradoxically causing less immediate pain than lesser burns because the nerve endings themselves have been destroyed. But this absence of pain masks catastrophic damage. The body loses its primary defense against infection, its ability to regulate temperature, and crucial fluids begin to leak from damaged tissues. Think about that for a moment. The thermal flash that creates these burns lasts only seconds, yet it sets in motion biological processes that will determine survival over the coming weeks and months. The pattern of burns often reflects the clothing worn at the moment of detonation, creating a terrible map of that final instant when normal life was transformed by atomic fire. But even as the thermal radiation sears exposed flesh, a far more destructive force is building. The intense heat of the fireball creates a massive expansion of air, generating a shockwave that races outward at supersonic speeds. This blast wave carries with it air pressures many times greater than the most violent hurricanes, along with winds that can exceed 300 miles per hour. When this wall of compressed air strikes a human body, the effects are devastating and immediate. The sudden increase in air pressure, called overpressure, can rupture eardrums at relatively modest levels of just 5 pounds per square inch above normal atmospheric pressure. As the pressure increases, the damage becomes more severe and more widespread throughout the body. At 15 pounds per square inch of overpressure, lung damage begins. The delicate alveoli, tiny air sacs where oxygen enters the bloodstream, begin to tear under the sudden pressure differential. Blood vessels in the lungs rupture, causing internal bleeding that can lead to death by drowning in one's own blood. The trauma is similar to what might occur in an extreme diving accident, but magnified across every air-filled space in the body. Higher overpressures cause even more catastrophic damage. The blast wave can literally throw human bodies through the air like projectiles, causing blunt force trauma when they impact buildings, vehicles, or the ground. Arms and legs are frequently severed by the tremendous forces involved. The human skeletal system, evolved to handle the stresses of normal movement and occasional falls, simply cannot withstand forces measured in tons per square inch. Internal organs suffer massive trauma as the shockwave passes through that body. The liver, spleen, and kidneys, organs rich in blood vessels, frequently rupture from the sudden pressure changes. The heart may stop beating due to the shock, even when no direct damage is apparent. The delicate structures of the inner ear, responsible for balance and hearing, are destroyed, leaving survivors disoriented and deaf. But perhaps, most insidiously, the blast wave is followed by powerful winds that carry with them a deadly cargo of debris. Glass fragments from shattered windows become projectiles travelling at lethal speeds. Pieces of concrete, metal, and wood are transformed into missiles that penetrate deeply into human tissue. These secondary missiles cause injuries that might be survivable individually, but become fatal when they occur by the thousands across a single victim. The combination of overpressure and wind effects creates what scientists call missile injuries. These predominate among blast survivors, accounting for the majority of trauma cases in the immediate aftermath of a nuclear explosion. The human body, pierced by countless fragments of the destroyed city, becomes a canvas of puncture wounds, lacerations, and embedded foreign objects. Yet even as the blast wave passes and the immediate mechanical violence ends, another form of destruction is already at work within the cells of survivors. Ionizing radiation, released in the first moments of the nuclear explosion, has been silently attacking the molecular foundation of life itself. Unlike thermal radiation or blast effects, ionizing radiation is invisible and initially painless. It passes through the human body like ghostly fingers, leaving behind a trail of damaged molecules and broken chemical bonds. The radiation exists in several forms, each with its own pattern of destruction. Gamma rays, high-energy electromagnetic radiation, penetrate deeply into tissues. Neutrons, uncharged particles from the nuclear reaction itself, can pass through the entire body while leaving a wake of radioactive atoms in their path. When ionizing radiation strikes a living cell, it can damage DNA directly by breaking the chemical bonds that hold the genetic code together. More commonly, it creates charged particles within the cell that react with water to form highly reactive molecules called free radicals. These molecular fragments attack cellular structures indiscriminately, damaging proteins, membranes, and genetic material with brutal efficiency. The cells most vulnerable to radiation damage are those that divide rapidly. Bone marrow, which produces the blood cells essential for carrying oxygen and fighting infection, is among the first to fail. Within hours of significant radiation exposure, the production of new red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets begins to slow and then stop entirely. The first sign of serious radiation exposure is often nausea and vomiting, occurring within hours of exposure to high doses. This initial phase, called the prodromal syndrome, reflects the body's immediate distress as cellular damage begins to accumulate. Victims may experience diarrhea, fatigue, and a general feeling of illness that can last for days before either improving or progressing to more severe symptoms. For those exposed to moderate radiation doses, a deceptive period may follow where symptoms seem to improve. This latent period can last days to weeks, during which victims feel relatively well and may believe they are recovering. But beneath this apparent improvement, crucial biological systems are slowly failing as damaged cells die and are not replaced. The most vulnerable victims are children and pregnant women, whose rapidly dividing cells are particularly susceptible to radiation damage. Children exposed to significant doses of radiation show symptoms earlier and more severely than adults. Pregnant women face the heartbreaking possibility of fetal death or severe birth defects as the radiation attacks the rapidly developing cells of the unborn child. As the latent period ends, the true extent of radiation damage becomes apparent. Hair begins to fall out, not gradually as in normal balding, but in clumps that come away at the slightest touch. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki described the horror of waking each morning to find their pillows covered with hair, and of pulling strands away with their fingers as the follicles died from radiation damage. The loss of hair becomes a visible marker of severe radiation exposure, but it signals far more devastating changes occurring within the body. White blood cell counts plummet, leaving survivors vulnerable to infections that would normally be trivial. Simple cuts become infected, and bacteria that normally live harmlessly in the intestines begin to invade other parts of the body. Bleeding becomes a constant threat as the production of platelets fails. Small blood vessels break spontaneously, causing bruises to appear without injury. More dangerously, internal bleeding can occur in the stomach, intestines, and lungs. Survivors describe vomiting blood clots and seeing their skin turn dark with subcutaneous bleeding. The intestinal tract, with its rapidly renewing lining, begins to fail. The protective barrier between the digestive system and the rest of the body breaks down, allowing bacteria and toxins to enter the bloodstream directly. Severe diarrhea, often bloody, depletes the body of fluids and essential electrolytes. The capacity to absorb nutrients from food disappears, leading to rapid weight loss and malnutrition even when food is available. In the most severe cases, a condition called acute radiation syndrome develops. The bone marrow fails completely, unable to produce the blood cells necessary for life. Infections overwhelm the compromised immune system. Internal bleeding becomes uncontrollable as platelet counts approach zero. Death typically occurs within weeks to months as multiple organ systems fail simultaneously. But for many survivors, The immediate effects of radiation exposure are only the beginning of a lifelong struggle with the consequences of atomic fire. The damaged DNA within cells may not kill the cell immediately, but can lead to errors in cellular reproduction that manifest years or even decades later as cancer. The increased cancer risk follows a grim timeline that researchers have traced through decades of studying atomic bomb survivors. Leukemia, cancer of the blood, forming tissues, appears first, typically 2 to 3 years after exposure. The peak incidence occurs around 6 to 8 years post-exposure, striking children with particular cruelty as their developing blood systems prove most vulnerable to malignant transformation. Solid cancers follow a different pattern, with increased rates appearing approximately 10 years after radiation exposure and continuing to rise throughout the survivors' lifetimes. Thyroid cancer, particularly common after childhood exposure, reflects the concentration of radioactive iodine in this hormone-producing gland. Breast cancer rates increase among women exposed during puberty when breast tissue is developing rapidly. Lung cancer, liver cancer, and stomach cancer all show elevated rates among heavily exposed survivors. Perhaps most tragically, the fear of genetic damage has haunted survivors and their descendants for generations. The possibility that radiation exposure might cause mutations that could be passed to children has created a shadow of worry that extends far beyond the immediate victims. While extensive studies have not demonstrated increased birth defects in the children of atomic bomb survivors, the fear itself has become part of the radiation legacy. This fear has led to discrimination against hibakusha, the Japanese term for atomic bomb survivors. Many have faced rejection in marriage prospects due to concerns about genetic damage or the possibility of radiation sickness being somehow contagious. The social isolation of survivors has added psychological trauma to their physical suffering. The immediate medical response to nuclear casualties reveals the overwhelming nature of these injuries. A single nuclear weapon detonation could produce tens of thousands of severe burn victims, requiring specialized treatment. The entire world's capacity for treating severe burns would be insufficient to handle the casualties from even a relatively small nuclear weapon used against a city. Current medical facilities designed to handle burn victims number in the low thousands globally. The specialized treatments required for severe radiation exposure are even more limited. The combination of burns, trauma, and radiation sickness creates medical challenges that exceed the capacity of any healthcare system to address effectively. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most victims died without receiving adequate medical care. Hospitals were destroyed by the blasts, medical personnel were among the casualties, and the nature of radiation injuries was not fully understood by the doctors who survived. Many victims died in agony, calling for water to relieve the burning sensation in their throats and stomachs, while their bodies slowly succumbed to the multiple forms of damage inflicted by the atomic explosions. The psychological effects of nuclear weapons on survivors have proven as enduring as the physical damage. Decades after the bombings, studies show elevated rates of anxiety and depression among hibakusha. The memories of that moment when the world changed forever, when the familiar suddenly became an inferno of destruction, continue to haunt those who lived through it. Survivors describe a persistent sense of being marked by their experience, of carrying within themselves the knowledge of what human beings can do to one another when they harness the power of the atom for destruction. This psychological burden has been passed down through families, creating a legacy of trauma that extends to children and grandchildren who never directly experienced the bombings. The environmental effects of nuclear weapons add another layer to their impact on human health. Radioactive fallout, the debris from the explosion mixed with fission products from the nuclear reaction, can spread over vast areas depending on weather conditions. This fallout continues to emit radiation for years, creating ongoing exposure risks for anyone in the affected areas. Fallout particles, some visible as a grey ash and others too small to see, settle on everything in their path. They contaminate food supplies, water sources, and the air itself. People in fallout areas can receive radiation exposure through multiple pathways: breathing contaminated air, drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food, or simply being in contact with contaminated surfaces. The radiation from fallout is particularly insidious because it delivers dose continuously over time, rather than in a single acute exposure. This chronic low-level exposure can be just as dangerous as acute high-dose exposure, but the effects may not become apparent for years or decades. Children are especially vulnerable because their developing bodies concentrate certain radioactive isotopes, particularly those that mimic essential nutrients like calcium or iodine. The geographic extent of dangerous fallout depends on many factors, including the size of the weapon, the height of the detonation, and prevailing weather conditions. For a ground-burst nuclear weapon, the dangerous fallout zone can extend 10 to 20 miles downwind, requiring evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. The economic and social disruption of such evacuations adds to the weapon's destructive impact. Even small nuclear weapons produce fallout effects that can affect areas far larger than the immediate blast zone. A 10-kiloton weapon, small by modern standards, could create fallout requiring the evacuation of areas encompassing millions of people if detonated near a major city. The medical and logistical challenges of caring for and relocating such populations would overwhelm any disaster response system. Understanding these effects transforms our perception of nuclear weapons from abstract strategic concepts to concrete threats against human biology and civilization itself. The human body, with its exquisite organization of cells, tissues, and organs, represents billions of years of evolutionary refinement. Nuclear weapons attack this organization at its most fundamental level, disrupting the chemical bonds that hold life together. The scale of destruction extends beyond individual casualties to threaten the basic infrastructure that supports human civilization. Medical systems, transportation networks, communication systems, and governmental structures all become casualties in nuclear attacks. The survivors face not only their personal injuries, but also the collapse of the systems they depend upon for recovery and healing. This brings us to consider how our understanding of nuclear weapons effects has evolved over the decades since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The initial studies of atomic bomb survivors were conducted by American researchers who viewed the victims primarily as subjects for scientific investigation rather than patients requiring treatment. This approach, while providing valuable scientific data, added to the trauma experienced by survivors who felt studied but not helped. The establishment of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in 1947 marked the beginning of systematic long-term health studies that continue to this day. These studies have provided crucial data about radiation effects on human health, but they have also highlighted the ethical complexities of studying victims of weapons while providing them little direct benefit from the research. Over time, the relationship between researchers and survivors has evolved toward greater collaboration and mutual respect. Survivors have become partners in the research rather than merely subjects, and their testimonies have become powerful tools for educating the world about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Modern medical understanding of radiation effects has improved dramatically since 1945. New treatments for radiation sickness have been developed, including medications that can stimulate bone marrow recovery and therapies that can help repair cellular damage. However, these treatments remain limited in their effectiveness and are most useful when applied to small numbers of patients with access to advanced medical facilities. The medical response to a modern nuclear attack would be complicated by several factors that did not exist in 1945. Modern cities have much higher population densities than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, potentially creating casualty numbers that would dwarf those of World War II. Modern nuclear weapons are typically much more powerful than the bombs used in Japan, creating correspondingly larger zones of destruction and radiation exposure. At the same time, modern emergency medical systems are far more sophisticated than those available in 1945. Trauma care, burn treatment, and critical care medicine have advanced enormously, potentially saving lives that would have been lost 7 decades ago. However, these advances would be meaningful only if the medical infrastructure itself survives the attack, and if the number of casualties does not overwhelm the system's capacity to respond. The global medical community has developed protocols for responding to radiation emergencies, based partly on the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. These protocols emphasize early decontamination to remove radioactive particles from the skin and clothing, triage systems to identify those most likely to benefit from treatment, and specialized therapies for radiation syndrome. However, medical professionals acknowledge that these protocols, while helpful for accidents involving small numbers of people, would be inadequate for the mass casualty situation created by nuclear weapons use. The combination of burns, trauma, and radiation exposure creates medical challenges that exceed current treatment capabilities when multiplied by the thousands or tens of thousands of victims that a nuclear attack would produce. The development of more powerful nuclear weapons since 1945 has created the potential for even more devastating effects on human health. Thermonuclear weapons, which derive their energy from nuclear fusion reactions, can be built with essentially unlimited power. The largest weapon ever tested, the Soviet Tsar bomber, was over 3,000 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Such weapons would create thermal radiation intense enough to cause third-degree burns at distances of dozens of miles. The blast effects would level reinforced concrete buildings at distances where the Hiroshima bomb caused only minor damage. The radiation dose would be lethal at far greater distances, and the fallout would contaminate areas the size of small countries. Fortunately, no weapons approaching the size of Tsar bomber are currently deployed, but even the nuclear weapons in modern arsenals are typically 10 to 100 times more powerful than those used in World War II. The effects on human health would be correspondingly more severe, both in the immediate destruction and in the long-term consequences for survivors. The existence of multiple nuclear weapons compounds these effects in ways that go beyond simple multiplication. A nuclear attack involving multiple weapons would overwhelm any possible medical response and could cause enough atmospheric and environmental damage to affect global climate patterns. The concept of nuclear winter, where smoke and debris from nuclear fires block sunlight and cause global cooling, represents another way in which nuclear weapons threaten human survival. Even a limited nuclear war involving less than 1% of the world's nuclear weapons could inject enough particles into the atmosphere to reduce global temperatures and disrupt agriculture worldwide. The resulting famine could threaten billions of people who live far from any nuclear explosions, demonstrating how nuclear weapons' effects extend far beyond their immediate targets. These broader effects illustrate how nuclear weapons represent a threat not just to the immediate victims, but to human civilization itself. The interconnected nature of modern society means that the collapse of major cities and the displacement of millions of people would create cascading effects throughout the global economy and political system. The study of nuclear weapons' effects on human health has also revealed the remarkable resilience of life in the face of extreme adversity. Many atomic bomb survivors have lived full lives, raised families, and made important contributions to society despite their terrible experiences. Their stories demonstrate the capacity of human beings to endure unimaginable suffering and to find meaning and purpose even after experiencing the worst that our species can inflict upon itself. These survivors have become powerful advocates for nuclear disarmament, using their personal experiences to educate the world about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Their testimony has been instrumental in building international support for nuclear arms control and disarmament efforts. The Hibakusha have repeatedly emphasized that their suffering should not be repeated, that the world should learn from their experience to prevent future nuclear weapons use. Their message carries unique moral authority because they alone among living people have experienced the full effects of nuclear weapons on human communities. Their advocacy has contributed to growing international recognition that nuclear weapons represent a humanitarian threat that transcends traditional concepts of military strategy and national security. The focus on the human consequences of nuclear weapons has helped shift the global discussion away from abstract strategic concepts toward the concrete reality of what these weapons do to human beings. This humanitarian perspective has led to new international efforts to ban nuclear weapons entirely, based on the argument that weapons causing such indiscriminate and long-lasting harm to human health and the environment should be prohibited under international law. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force in 2021, represents the first attempt to create a comprehensive legal ban on nuclear weapons based primarily on humanitarian grounds. The medical evidence from Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues to inform these discussions, providing scientific documentation of nuclear weapons effects that cannot be dismissed or minimized. The decades of health studies conducted on atomic bomb survivors have created an unparalleled database of information about how nuclear weapons affect human health across entire lifetimes and generations. This scientific evidence has helped establish that there is no safe level of exposure to nuclear weapons effects and no acceptable number of nuclear weapons casualties. The medical data supports the conclusion that nuclear weapons are fundamentally incompatible with human health and survival, making their elimination a public health imperative as well as a moral one. As we consider the full scope of nuclear weapons' effects on human health, we are confronted with questions that extend beyond medicine and science to fundamental issues about human nature and civilization. What does it mean that our species has created weapons capable of such destruction? How do we process the knowledge that the same scientific understanding that has enabled us to cure diseases and extend life has also given us the power to destroy life on an unprecedented scale? These questions become even more profound when we consider that the nuclear weapons in existence today are far more numerous and powerful than those used in 1945. The potential for destruction has grown exponentially, while our understanding of the human consequences has become more complete and more sobering. The medical legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki serves as both a warning and a responsibility. It warns us of the consequences of nuclear weapons use and challenges us to prevent such suffering from occurring again. It creates a responsibility to remember and to learn, to ensure that the sacrifices of atomic bomb survivors contribute to a future free from the threat of nuclear destruction. This understanding connects us to the profound question of how human knowledge and human wisdom can be brought into balance, how our technical capabilities can be guided by our moral understanding of their consequences. The human body exists as a remarkable testament to engineering precision, maintaining its internal temperature at 37 degrees Celsius with the same unwavering dedication as the most sophisticated thermostat. Yet this biological masterpiece faces its greatest test when confronted with the cold, when the very foundations of thermal control begin to falter and the body must deploy its most ancient survival mechanisms. Understanding how our bodies respond to extreme cold reveals not just the fragility of human life, but also the extraordinary resilience hidden within our cells. When we step into a cold environment, our body immediately recognizes the threat through specialized temperature sensors scattered across our skin. These thermoreceptors, embedded in our peripheral tissues, act like thousands of tiny sentinels constantly monitoring the thermal landscape. The moment they detect a drop in temperature, they send urgent signals through our nervous system to a small but crucial region of the brain called the hypothalamus. Think of this area as the body's central command center for temperature regulation, a sophisticated control room that processes incoming temperature data and orchestrates our physiological response to cold. The hypothalamus operates with remarkable precision, maintaining what scientists call the thermoneutral zone, that narrow band between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius, where our bodies function optimally. Even slight deviations from this range trigger immediate corrective measures. When cold threatens this delicate balance, the hypothalamus initiates a cascade of responses that have kept mammals alive for millions of years. The first line of defense involves redirecting blood flow away from our extremities toward our vital organs, a process called peripheral vasoconstriction. This evolutionary strategy prioritizes the survival of our heart, brain, and other essential systems by sacrificing the comfort and warmth of our hands, feet, and outer tissues. As the cold intensifies, our bodies deploy their most recognizable defense mechanism, shivering. These involuntary muscle contractions serve as biological furnaces, rapidly generating heat through cellular activity. The rhythmic trembling that we experience during cold exposure can increase our metabolic rate by 2 to 5 times above baseline levels, transforming our muscles into heat-generating engines. But shivering represents just one aspect of our thermal defense system, and it comes with significant costs in terms of energy expenditure and coordination. What makes our cold response truly fascinating is the discovery that humans possess a second, more sophisticated form of heat generation called non-shivering thermogenesis. This process centers around a special type of tissue known as brown adipose tissue, or brown fat, which was once thought to disappear entirely after infancy. Scientists now know that adults retain deposits of this remarkable tissue, primarily around the shoulders, neck, and spine. Unlike regular white fat, which stores energy, brown fat burns calories specifically to produce heat. When activated by cold exposure, brown fat cells unleash their mitochondrial powerhouses, creating warmth without the energy waste and physical disruption of shivering. The mechanism behind brown fat activation reads like molecular poetry. Cold exposure triggers the sympathetic nervous system to release norepinephrine, which binds to receptors on brown fat cells. This binding activates a unique protein called uncoupling protein 1, or UCP1, which essentially short-circuits the normal energy production process in mitochondria. Instead of storing energy as chemical bonds, the mitochondria release it directly as heat, warming the blood that flows through these tissues and distributing that warmth throughout the body. Recent research suggests that brown fat can be recruited and expanded through regular cold exposure, meaning our bodies can actually adapt to become more efficient at staying warm. Think about that for a moment. Our bodies can literally reshape themselves to better handle cold environments, creating more of the very tissue that keeps us warm without conscious effort or voluntary movement. The transition from normal thermal regulation to hypothermia occurs when these natural warming mechanisms become overwhelmed. Medical science defines hypothermia as a core body temperature below 35 degrees Celsius, but this clinical definition barely captures the complex biological drama that unfolds as our internal temperature drops. Initially, as body temperature falls toward 35 degrees, most people experience intense shivering, rapid breathing, and a sense of urgency as their bodies fight to maintain warmth. Mental function typically remains intact during this mild hypothermia stage, though fine motor coordination may suffer. As cooling continues and core temperature drops below 32 degrees, the body enters moderate hypothermia. The shivering that once provided crucial warmth begins to fade, not because the person feels warmer, but because the very mechanisms that generate shivering start to fail. Paradoxically, some individuals may even feel warm and begin removing clothing, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. This occurs because the hypothalamus, stressed by prolonged cold exposure, may malfunction and misread the body's thermal state. Coordination deteriorates significantly, thinking becomes clouded, and the person may appear confused or disoriented. When core temperature falls below 28 degrees Celsius, severe hypothermia takes hold, and the body begins to shut down non-essential systems to preserve what little warmth remains. Heart rate slows dramatically, sometimes dropping to just a few beats per minute. Breathing becomes shallow and irregular. The person may lose consciousness as the brain, despite receiving priority blood flow, begins to suffer from the cold. At this stage, the line between life and death becomes frighteningly thin. Yet, within this apparent biological crisis lies one of medicine's most remarkable discoveries. The same cold that threatens life can also preserve it, slowing cellular metabolism to such a degree that tissues can survive far longer without oxygen than would normally be possible. This phenomenon forms the foundation for one of the most extraordinary survival stories in medical history. In May 1999, a 29-year-old Swedish radiologist named Anna Bagenholm was skiing with colleagues in the mountains of northern Norway when a routine descent turned into a fight for survival. Bagenholm lost control and crashed through the ice of a frozen stream, becoming trapped head first beneath 20 centimeters of solid ice. Her friends could see only her skis protruding above the surface, and despite desperate efforts, they could not free her from the rocky trap beneath the ice. For 40 minutes, Bagenholm remained conscious in an air pocket beneath the ice, calling out to her friends and struggling against the rocks that held her. The water temperature hovered near freezing, and her heavy ski clothing quickly became saturated, adding weight that pulled her deeper into the stream. After 40 minutes, her voice fell silent, and her movement stopped. She had lost consciousness as hypothermia overwhelmed her body's ability to function. When rescue teams finally cut through the ice 80 minutes after her initial fall, they pulled out what appeared to be a lifeless body. Bagenholm showed no signs of life, no pulse, no breathing, no response to stimulation. Her skin had taken on the waxy pale appearance of death. Emergency responders immediately began CPR and rushed her to the University Hospital of North Norway in Tromsø, where Dr. Mads Gilbert and his team waited with a mixture of hope and medical skepticism. Upon arrival at the hospital, Bagenholm's core body temperature measured just 13.7 degrees Celsius, the lowest body temperature ever recorded in a living person. To put this in perspective, most medical textbooks suggested that survival was impossible once core temperature dropped below 15 degrees. Her pupils were fixed and dilated, her body was rigid, and electrocardiogram readings showed only a flat line. By every conventional medical measure, Anna Bagenholm was dead. But Dr. Gilbert understood something crucial about hypothermia that has become a fundamental principle in emergency medicine. He refused to declare death until Bagenholm had been warmed, following the maxim that patients are not dead until they are warm and dead. His team connected her to an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machine, a sophisticated device that could warm her blood outside her body before returning it to her circulation. For 9 hours, they maintained continuous CPR while gradually raising her body temperature. The process required extraordinary patience and precision. Warming had to proceed slowly to prevent dangerous shifts in blood chemistry and to avoid overwhelming her cardiovascular system. As her temperature gradually climbed from the record-breaking low of 13.7 degrees, something remarkable happened. At 22 hours and 15 minutes after her initial cardiac arrest, with her body temperature now approaching normal levels, Anna Bagenholm's heart spontaneously resumed beating. The miracle of her survival lay in the very cold that had nearly killed her. The rapid cooling of her brain and vital organs had slowed her cellular metabolism to such a degree that her tissues required minimal oxygen to survive. Instead of the typical 3 to 5 minutes that brain cells can survive without oxygen at normal body temperature, her neurons had endured hours of near-freezing conditions while maintaining their structural integrity. The continuous CPR provided just enough circulation to keep essential processes functioning at their dramatically reduced metabolic rate. Bagenholm's recovery was gradual but ultimately complete. After 12 days in a coma, she opened her eyes. Though initially paralyzed from nerve damage caused by the prolonged cold exposure, she gradually regained function through intensive rehabilitation. More than a year later, she walked out of the same hospital where she had been declared clinically dead, not only alive but neurologically intact. She returned to work as a radiologist, specializing in the very hospital that had saved her life. Her case transformed medical understanding of hypothermia and led to the development of therapeutic hypothermia protocols now used worldwide. When patients suffer cardiac arrest, stroke, or other conditions that deprive the brain of oxygen, controlled cooling can extend the window for successful treatment and reduce long-term neurological damage. The principle that saved Bagenholm now saves hundreds of patients each year, turning what was once considered an inevitably fatal condition into a potentially treatable emergency. The biological mechanisms that enabled Bagenholm's survival extend far beyond simple temperature effects. When our bodies encounter extreme cold, they activate a complex network of protective responses that we share with our mammalian relatives. One of the most fascinating of these is the mammalian diving reflex, an ancient response triggered when cold water contacts the face and nasal passages. This reflex, first described scientifically in the 1700s, demonstrates the remarkable evolutionary heritage we carry within our cells. When cold water touches the face, specialized nerves send signals to the brainstem, which immediately activates both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system responses. The heart rate drops dramatically, sometimes by 25% or more. Blood vessels in the arms and legs constrict, shunting oxygenated blood toward the heart, lungs, and brain. Breathing patterns change, and the spleen contracts, releasing stored red blood cells into circulation to maximize oxygen carrying capacity. Marine mammals like seals and whales have evolved this reflex to extraordinary degrees, allowing them to dive for extended periods while conserving oxygen. A seal's heart rate can drop from 125 beats per minute to as low as 10 during an extended dive. Elephant seals have been recorded staying underwater for over 2 hours, their bodies in a state of controlled suspended animation that prioritizes survival of essential organs. Humans retain a vestigial version of this same reflex. While we cannot achieve the dramatic physiological changes seen in marine mammals, our bodies still respond to facial cold water contact with measurable drops in heart rate and peripheral blood flow. This response is particularly strong in children and may explain some cases of remarkable cold water survival. The reflex appears to be one reason why children sometimes survive longer periods underwater than adults. Their smaller bodies and more active diving reflex providing additional protection against oxygen deprivation. Understanding the diving reflex has practical applications beyond emergency medicine. Some people use controlled activation of this response for stress management, placing cold packs over their eyes and upper cheeks to trigger the calming effects of reduced heart rate and blood pressure. The technique has shown promise for managing anxiety and panic attacks, offering a biological reset button that can quickly shift the body from a state of arousal to one of calm focus. The study of extreme cold survival has also revealed fascinating insights about cellular adaptations that occur during hypothermia. As body temperature drops, fundamental biochemical processes slow down in a coordinated fashion. Enzyme activity decreases, but not uniformly, with some critical pathways maintaining function while others shut down completely. Cell membranes change their composition to remain flexible at lower temperatures, and protein structures adjust to maintain essential functions despite the altered thermal environment. Perhaps most remarkably, research suggests that cells undergoing controlled cooling may actually become more resistant to damage from other stresses. The process of cold adaptation appears to trigger protective mechanisms that extend beyond temperature regulation. Studies have found that controlled hypothermia can protect against stroke damage, reduce inflammation, and even slow certain aspects of cellular aging. This protective effect may explain why some hibernating animals demonstrate remarkable longevity. Ground squirrels, for example, can survive body temperatures that would instantly kill most mammals, dropping their core temperature to nearly 3 degrees below freezing, while maintaining brain temperatures just above the freezing point of water. During hibernation, their heart rates drop to approximately 1 beat per minute, and they can remain in this state for months without apparent harm. Scientists believe these animals have evolved mechanisms to prevent ice crystal formation in their blood and tissues, though the exact processes remain mysterious. The implications of this research extend into realms that once existed only in science fiction. Scientists are exploring the possibility of inducing controlled suspended animation in critically injured patients, essentially putting them on pause while trauma surgeons work to repair life-threatening injuries. Early experiments with emergency department patients have shown promising results, with controlled cooling extending the window for successful treatment of massive blood loss and other critical conditions. The field of organ transplantation has also benefited enormously from advances in hypothermia research. Donor organs are now routinely cooled during transport and storage, dramatically extending their viability and improving transplant success rates. The techniques developed from studying extreme hypothermia survival have made it possible to transport organs across continents and coordinate complex multi-organ transplants that would have been impossible just decades ago. But cold exposure affects more than just emergency scenarios and medical procedures. Regular exposure to cold temperatures can actually improve our body's efficiency at generating heat and maintaining core temperature. This process, known as cold acclimation, demonstrates the remarkable plasticity of human physiology. People who regularly expose themselves to cold environments, whether through winter sports, cold water swimming, or simply spending time outdoors in cold weather, develop measurable improvements in their thermal regulation abilities. Cold acclimation triggers several beneficial adaptations. Brown fat deposits increase in size and activity, making non-shivering thermogenesis more efficient. Blood vessel responses improve, allowing better regulation of heat loss through the skin. The threshold temperature at which shivering begins drops, meaning the body can maintain comfort at lower temperatures without involuntary muscle contractions. Even subjective temperature perception changes, with cold-adapted individuals reporting greater comfort and less distress when exposed to low temperatures. Recent studies have found that just 10 days of controlled cold exposure can significantly increase brown fat activity and improve cold tolerance in previously unacclimatized individuals. This suggests that our capacity for cold adaptation remains active throughout our lives, waiting to be triggered by appropriate environmental stimuli. The implications extend beyond mere comfort, as improved thermoregulation may contribute to better metabolic health, enhanced immune function, and increased resistance to temperature-related stress. The relationship between cold exposure and human health appears to follow ancient patterns encoded in our evolutionary history. Our ancestors faced regular temperature challenges that modern heated environments have largely eliminated. Some researchers suggest that occasional cold stress may be necessary for optimal physiological function, much as physical exercise provides beneficial stress to our musculoskeletal and cardiovascular systems. Indigenous populations living in Arctic environments demonstrate remarkable adaptations to extreme cold that have developed over thousands of years. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic have evolved physiological changes that improve their cold tolerance, including altered blood flow patterns, increased metabolic efficiency, and enhanced ability to maintain finger and toe temperature during cold exposure. These adaptations appear to combine genetic changes with cultural practices and individual acclimatization, creating integrated survival strategies that enable life in some of Earth's most challenging environments. Similarly, the Ama and Henyo divers of Korea and Japan have developed extraordinary cold water tolerance through lifelong practice of diving for shellfish and seaweed in frigid ocean waters. These women, some continuing their diving careers well into their 70s, demonstrate enhanced diving reflexes, improved cold tolerance, and remarkable breath-holding abilities that exceed those of most trained athletes. Their achievements highlight the extent to which human bodies can adapt to extreme thermal challenges when faced with consistent, long-term exposure. The cellular mechanisms underlying these adaptations continue to surprise researchers. Beyond the well-understood changes in brown fat and blood vessel responses, scientists have discovered that cold exposure can influence gene expression patterns, mitochondrial function, and even the composition of gut bacteria. These changes suggest that thermal adaptation involves coordinated adjustments across multiple biological systems, creating comprehensive responses that extend far beyond simple temperature regulation. One particularly intriguing area of research involves the role of cold shock proteins, specialized molecules that cells produce when exposed to temperature stress. These proteins help maintain cellular function during temperature changes and may contribute to the protective effects observed during controlled hypothermia. Understanding how these proteins work could lead to new therapeutic approaches for conditions ranging from stroke to neurodegenerative diseases. The study of extreme cold survival has also revealed unexpected connections between temperature regulation and other physiological processes. Scientists have found that brown fat activation influences blood sugar regulation, potentially helping to prevent diabetes. Cold exposure appears to stimulate immune system function, possibly explaining why some people report fewer infections during winter months when they maintain regular cold exposure routines. Even sleep quality may improve with appropriate cold exposure, as the natural temperature drop that occurs during evening hours helps trigger the onset of restorative sleep phases. These discoveries challenge traditional assumptions about optimal thermal environments for human health. While extreme cold remains dangerous and potentially fatal, moderate cold stress may actually benefit our physiology in ways that constant thermal comfort cannot provide. The concept of hormesis, beneficial stress that strengthens biological systems, appears to apply to temperature as well as exercise, nutrition, and other lifestyle factors. Future research in thermal physiology promises to unlock even more secrets about human cold adaptation. Scientists are investigating whether controlled cold exposure might slow aspects of aging, enhance cognitive function, or improve recovery from injury and illness. Early studies suggest intriguing possibilities, though much more research is needed to understand the optimal approaches and long-term effects of various cold exposure protocols. The therapeutic applications of controlled hypothermia continue to expand as medical technology advances. New techniques for precisely controlling body temperature during medical procedures allow surgeons to operate on previously inoperable conditions. Heart surgeries that once carried enormous risks can now be performed with the patient's body cooled to reduce oxygen demands and provide additional safety margins. Brain surgeries benefit from temperature control that protects delicate neural tissues from the stress of interrupted blood flow. Emergency medicine has embraced therapeutic hypothermia as a standard treatment for cardiac arrest survivors. Patients who regain a pulse after successful resuscitation are now routinely cooled for 12 to 24 hours to minimize brain damage from the oxygen deprivation that occurred during cardiac arrest. This protocol has dramatically improved survival rates and neurological outcomes, turning what was once a rarely survivable event into a condition with meaningful recovery potential. The equipment and techniques developed for therapeutic hypothermia have become increasingly sophisticated. Modern cooling systems can precisely control body temperature to within fractions of a degree, monitor vital signs continuously, and automatically adjust cooling rates based on patient response. These technological advances make controlled hypothermia safer and more effective than ever before, expanding its applications to new medical conditions and patient populations. Research continues into the optimal timing, duration, and target temperatures for therapeutic hypothermia in different medical situations. Scientists are investigating whether earlier initiation of cooling, different target temperatures, or longer cooling durations might provide additional benefits. They are also exploring the use of selective cooling techniques that target specific body regions while maintaining normal temperatures elsewhere, potentially maximizing benefits while minimizing complications. The molecular mechanisms that make extreme cold survival possible continue to yield insights relevant to many areas of medicine and biology. Understanding how cells maintain function at low temperatures has implications for food preservation, pharmaceutical storage, and even space exploration. The same principles that allow Anna Bagenholm to survive record-breaking hypothermia may someday enable long-distance space travel or extended medical procedures that are currently impossible. As our understanding of cold physiology deepens, new questions emerge about the limits of human thermal adaptation. How cold can the human body become and still maintain the potential for full recovery? What factors determine individual variation in cold tolerance and survival potential? Can we enhance natural cold resistance through training, nutrition, or medical interventions? These questions drive ongoing research that may someday redefine what we consider possible in terms of human survival under extreme conditions. The story of human cold survival represents a remarkable intersection of evolution, physiology, and medical innovation. From the ancient mammalian diving reflex that we share with seals and whales, to the cutting-edge medical techniques that save cardiac arrest patients, our relationship with cold demonstrates both our vulnerability and our extraordinary resilience. The same temperature that can kill us in minutes can also preserve us for hours, creating opportunities for medical interventions that seem to defy the boundaries between life and death. The practical implications of cold survival research extend beyond emergency medicine into daily life considerations for anyone who spends time in cold environments. Understanding how our bodies respond to cold can help us make better decisions about clothing, activity levels, and safety precautions during winter weather. Recognizing the early signs of hypothermia in ourselves and others can prevent minor cold exposure from becoming a medical emergency. The psychological aspects of cold survival also deserve consideration. The stress of extreme cold affects mental function, decision-making, and emotional regulation in ways that can compromise survival behaviors. People experiencing hypothermia may make poor decisions, become apathetic about their situation, or fail to recognize the severity of their condition. Understanding these psychological effects can help in both prevention and treatment of cold-related emergencies. Training programs for outdoor enthusiasts, military personnel, and emergency responders increasingly incorporate realistic cold exposure scenarios that help individuals understand their personal responses to temperature stress. These programs teach not only technical survival skills, but also the mental strategies needed to maintain effective decision-making under thermal stress. The knowledge gained from extreme survival cases like Anna Bagenholm's informs these training approaches and helps establish safety protocols that maximize survival chances in cold emergencies. The environmental implications of human cold adaptation research take on new relevance as climate patterns shift and extreme weather events become more common. Understanding how communities can adapt to changing temperature patterns, including both extreme cold and heat events, becomes increasingly important for public health planning. The physiological principles discovered through hypothermia research contribute to strategies for helping populations cope with thermal stresses that may become more frequent in coming decades. This brings us to explore how our understanding deepens when we consider the body's responses to the opposite extreme, where heat rather than cold becomes the primary threat to human survival. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a pier, feeling the familiar pressure of air around your body, 14.7 pounds pressing on every square inch of your skin, a constant that your nervous system learned to ignore before you were even born. This is one atmosphere, one bar of pressure, the baseline from which all underwater adventures begin. But beneath the surface of our planet's oceans lies a realm where this gentle embrace becomes something altogether more formidable, where pressure transforms from invisible companion to crushing adversary. The human body, with all its remarkable adaptations, remains fundamentally terrestrial in design. We carry within us pockets of air, spaces filled with gas that compress under pressure like tiny balloons squeezed in an ever-tightening grip. Our lungs, our sinuses, the delicate chambers of our middle ears, all these air-filled cavities make us vulnerable in ways that our ancestors who first ventured into the sea could never have imagined. For every 33 feet we descend into the ocean's depths, the pressure doubles, triples, multiplies in a relentless mathematical progression that turns water into a force as unyielding as stone. Think about that for a moment. At just 100 feet below the surface, the pressure pushing against your chest equals 4 atmospheres, 4 times the weight of all the air above us on land. Your lungs, those delicate sacs designed to expand and contract in the gentle rhythm of breathing, begin to compress like accordions in the hands of an invisible giant. The nitrogen dissolved in your bloodstream, normally as harmless as the air you breathe, starts its subtle invasion of your nervous system, creating a cocktail of confusion and euphoria that divers have nicknamed nitrogen narcosis or the raptures of the deep. Scientists have discovered that this phenomenon occurs because nitrogen, under pressure, begins to dissolve into the fatty tissues of your brain in much the same way that carbon dioxide dissolves into a carbonated beverage. As pressure increases with depth, more nitrogen enters your bloodstream and neural tissues. At depths below 100 feet, divers often report feeling as though they have consumed several cocktails, their judgment clouded, their coordination compromised. Some describe a euphoric lightness, while others experience anxiety and disorientation. The effects vary from person to person and from dive to dive, but the underlying mechanism remains constant, nitrogen acting as an anesthetic agent in the pressurized environment of the deep. This narcotic effect follows a predictable pattern. At around 150 feet, most divers lose the ability to perform simple mental tasks. They may forget to monitor their air supply or swim away from their diving companions. At 300 feet, hallucinations become common. Some divers report seeing mermaids or underwater cities, their minds constructing elaborate fantasies from the sparse sensory input of the deep ocean environment. Beyond 400 feet, breathing compressed air, consciousness begins to slip away entirely. It is a seductive progression, this rapture of the deep, one that has claimed many lives as divers, intoxicated by nitrogen, made fatal decisions in the crushing darkness below. But nitrogen narcosis represents only one facet of pressure's assault on human physiology. Consider what happens to the very architecture of your body as you descend. Your rib cage, designed to protect your organs and provide structure for breathing, begins to compress inward. The air spaces within your chest cavity shrink dramatically. If you could somehow survive at the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches, 11 kilometers below the surface, the pressure would exceed 8 tons per square inch. Your lungs would collapse completely, forcing any remaining air into the rigid spaces of your throat and airways. The delicate alveoli, those millions of tiny sacs where oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange occurs, would be compressed beyond function. At such depths, nitrogen becomes the least of your concerns. The sheer mechanical force of water pressure would cause your blood vessels to rupture, leading to massive internal bleeding. Your organs, squeezed beyond their limits, would cease to function within minutes. Even your bones, seemingly solid and unchanging, would begin to deform under pressures that exceed anything evolution prepared them to withstand. The human body would be crushed not by a single dramatic collapse, but by the systematic failure of every air containing space and pressure sensitive system within us. Yet remarkably, life thrives in these crushing depths. The deep ocean teems with creatures that navigate pressures that would instantly destroy human tissue. How do they manage this seemingly impossible feat? The answer lies in a fundamental difference in body composition. While humans carry substantial volumes of compressible gas within our bodies, Most deep-sea creatures are composed primarily of water and other incompressible fluids. Water, unlike air, cannot be squeezed into a smaller volume regardless of the pressure applied. This basic physical principle explains why a fish can swim comfortably at depths where human bones would shatter. The secret weapon employed by many of the deepest living fish species is a remarkable molecule called trimethylamine N oxide, or TMAO. This chemical compound, which gives marine creatures their distinctive fishy scent, serves as nature's pressure protection system at the molecular level. Research conducted by scientists at the University of Leeds and other institutions has revealed that TMAO acts as a cellular guardian, preserving the structure and function of proteins under extreme pressure. As fish live deeper in the ocean, the concentration of TMAO in their tissues increases proportionally, creating a perfect balance between external pressure and internal molecular stability. At normal atmospheric pressure, water molecules arrange themselves in a tetrahedral network, a structure that allows proteins to maintain their proper shape and function. But as pressure increases, this network begins to distort and change shape, forcing water into spaces within proteins where it does not belong. This intrusion disrupts the delicate folding patterns that give proteins their functionality, essentially denaturing them in a process similar to cooking. TMAO prevents this molecular disaster by strengthening the hydrogen bonds between water molecules, maintaining their proper structure even under crushing pressure. The correlation between TMAO concentration and depth is so precise that scientists can predict the deepest waters a particular fish species can inhabit simply by measuring the TMAO levels in their tissues. The Hadal snailfish, one of the deepest living vertebrates on Earth, found at depths exceeding 25,000 feet in ocean trenches, carries concentrations of TMAO so high that they would be toxic to surface-dwelling creatures. Yet for these remarkable fish, TMAO represents the difference between life and death in the crushing abyss. This molecular adaptation extends beyond simple pressure resistance. TMAO also helps deep sea creatures cope with the extreme cold of the abyss, where temperatures hover just above freezing. The same mechanism that protects proteins from pressure also stabilizes them against temperature fluctuations, creating a dual-purpose biological tool that enables life in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Researchers have discovered that the relationship between TMAO and environmental extremes is so fundamental that it may represent one of the earliest biochemical adaptations that allowed life to colonize the deep ocean billions of years ago. The implications of TMAO research extend far beyond marine biology. Medical researchers are exploring applications for this remarkable molecule in treating human diseases that involve protein misfolding, such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Food scientists are investigating how TMAO might be used to preserve proteins during high-pressure processing. The humble fish that swims in crushing darkness miles below our feet has provided insights that may revolutionize fields ranging from medicine to food preservation. But what of those creatures that, like humans, must return to the surface to breathe? Marine mammals such as whales and dolphins face a unique challenge. They must descend to crushing depths while carrying air in their lungs, yet they avoid the catastrophic consequences that would befall a human diver attempting the same feat. The solution lies in anatomical adaptations so elegant they seem almost supernatural. When a sperm whale begins its descent toward the abyss, pursuing giant squid in the crushing darkness 2 kilometers below the surface, its body undergoes a remarkable transformation. The whale's ribcage, unlike our own rigid structure, is composed of flexible cartilage that allows the entire chest cavity to collapse under pressure. As the whale descends, its lungs compress dramatically, forcing all the air they contain away from the delicate alveoli where gas exchange normally occurs. This collapse prevents the uptake of nitrogen at depth, eliminating the risk of both nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness that plague human divers. The whale's cardiovascular system responds to this compression with a suite of adaptations that redirect blood flow away from collapsed lung tissue and towards specialized vascular networks called rete mirabilia. These complex arrangements of blood vessels act like internal pressure regulators, filling with blood to obliterate air spaces and prevent the tissue damage that would otherwise occur. The whale's heart rate drops to as few as 14 beats per minute, about 1/3 the rate of a human in a coma, conserving oxygen for the most critical organs while the animal hunts in the lightless depths. Meanwhile, specialized proteins called myoglobin, found in extraordinarily high concentrations within whale muscle tissue, store oxygen like biological batteries. Unlike human muscles, which rely primarily on oxygen delivered through the bloodstream during activity, whale muscles carry their own oxygen reserves, enough to sustain the animal during dives lasting more than an hour. This adaptation allows whales to continue functioning even when their lungs are completely collapsed and contributing no oxygen to their blood. The whale's blood itself carries a higher concentration of red blood cells and hemoglobin than human blood, creating additional oxygen carrying capacity. When combined with the ability to shunt blood flow away from non-essential organs during a dive, this creates a biological life support system that can sustain consciousness and muscular activity at depths where human technology still struggles to function reliably. Consider the extraordinary precision of these adaptations. The whale must compress its lungs enough to prevent nitrogen absorption, while maintaining just enough gas exchange to avoid complete oxygen starvation. It must slow its heart rate to conserve oxygen while ensuring adequate blood flow to the brain and other vital organs. It must store enough oxygen in blood and muscle to fuel an hour of hunting activity, while simultaneously managing the pressure changes that occur during ascent and descent. The margin for error in this biological balancing act is virtually zero, yet whales perform these feats multiple times each day with seeming effortlessness. Recent research has revealed that some marine mammals can actually adjust their diving response based on the expected duration and depth of their dive. Elephant seals, those massive pinnipeds that can dive for hours at depths exceeding 1,500 meters, appear to anticipate their diving needs and modify their physiology accordingly. Before beginning a shallow foraging dive, the heart rate reduction is modest and their lung compression limited. But when preparing for a deep extended dive, the same animal initiates dramatic cardiovascular changes that optimize oxygen utilization for the challenging journey ahead. This adaptive flexibility suggests a level of physiological control that borders on the conscious. The animal somehow assesses the requirements of its upcoming dive and adjusts its internal systems to match those needs. Scientists studying this phenomenon have discovered that the diving response in marine mammals is not simply an automatic reflex triggered by submersion, but rather a complex anticipatory adaptation that can be modified by experience, environmental conditions, and behavioral context. The discovery that marine mammals can suffer from decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends under certain circumstances, has added another layer of complexity to our understanding of deep diving physiology. While their anatomical adaptations normally prevent the formation of nitrogen bubbles in their tissues, extreme stress, such as that caused by exposure to human-made sonar, can disrupt their normal diving physiology. Under these conditions, blood flow may be redirected to normally collapsed lung regions, allowing nitrogen uptake to occur and creating the condition for bubble formation during ascent. This vulnerability highlights the delicate balance that governs life in the deep ocean. Even the most perfectly adapted creatures operate within narrow physiological margins that can be disrupted by environmental changes or unusual stresses. The whale's mastery of pressure is not absolute, but rather represents a finely tuned equilibrium between internal physiology and external environment, an equilibrium that human activities increasingly threaten to disturb. The study of how organisms cope with pressure has revealed fundamental principles that apply far beyond marine environments. Researchers have found that the same molecular mechanisms that allow deep sea creatures to survive crushing pressure also help organisms cope with other environmental extremes. The proteins that resist pressure, induced deformation, are often the same ones that maintain function at temperature extremes or in highly acidic conditions. This suggests that pressure adaptation may have been a crucial step in the evolution of life's ability to colonize extreme environments throughout our planet. High-pressure research has practical applications that extend into fields ranging from food preservation to pharmaceutical development. The food industry uses high-pressure processing to eliminate harmful bacteria while preserving nutritional content and flavor, a technique inspired by studying how deep sea organisms maintain protein function under extreme conditions. Pharmaceutical companies are investigating pressure-resistant proteins as potential templates for developing more stable drug formulations that maintain their effectiveness under challenging storage and transportation conditions. The extreme environment of the deep ocean has also provided insights into the limits of life itself. Scientists have discovered microorganisms thriving in the deepest ocean trenches at pressures exceeding 1,000 atmospheres, temperatures near freezing and in complete darkness. These extremophiles, as they are known, expand our understanding of the conditions under which life can persist and inform our search for life on other planets where extreme conditions might be the norm rather than the exception. Some researchers speculate that the pressure adaptations we observe in Earth's deep ocean creatures might provide clues about the forms life could take in the subsurface oceans of moons like Europa or Enceladus. If life exists in the dark, pressurized waters beneath the ice shells of these distant worlds, it may employ strategies similar to those we see in our own planet's deepest environments. The TMAO that protects a Hadal snailfish from crushing pressure might represent a universal solution to the challenges of high-pressure life throughout the cosmos. The human quest to explore these crushing depths has driven remarkable innovations in engineering and material science. The development of deep diving submersibles capable of withstanding the pressure at the bottom of ocean trenches has required advances in metallurgy, electronics, and life support systems that rival those developed for space exploration. In many ways, creating a vehicle capable of carrying humans to the deepest parts of our oceans presents greater technical challenges than sending them to the International Space Station. The pressure vessels that protect human explorers at depth must be precision, engineered spheres of specially treated steel or titanium, their walls thick enough to resist pressures that would crush conventional submarines like empty soda cans. The mathematics of pressure vessel design become increasingly unforgiving as depth increases, each additional kilometre of depth requiring exponentially stronger materials and more precise manufacturing tolerances. The margin for error in deep ocean exploration is measured in fractions of inches of steel thickness and microscopic flaws in welds. Yet even with the most advanced technology, human exploration of the deepest ocean remains limited to brief visits in protective vessels. We remain tourists in the abyss, observers rather than inhabitants of this vast three-dimensional realm that covers more than 60% of our planet's surface. The crushing pressure that makes these depths uninhabitable for humans also makes them largely inaccessible to detailed study, leaving vast regions of our own planet more mysterious than the surface of Mars. This inaccessibility has preserved the deep ocean as one of Earth's last great frontiers, a realm where new species are discovered regularly and fundamental biological processes remain poorly understood. Every expedition to the deep ocean returns with evidence of life forms that challenge our understanding of biology and ecology. Creatures that generate their own light through bioluminescence, predators that hunt by sensing electrical fields, entire ecosystems that derive their energy from chemical reactions rather than sunlight, all thriving under pressures that would destroy human tissue in seconds. The pressure that crushes human bodies enables entirely different forms of existence in the deep ocean. Some creatures use pressure differentials to their advantage, employing hydrostatic forces to move through the water column or to capture prey. Others have evolved pressure-sensitive organs that allow them to detect subtle changes in depth and navigate three-dimensional space with extraordinary precision. The crushing environment that represents death to humans becomes a tool for survival in the hands, or rather the fins, of deep-sea specialists. Recent advances in underwater robotics have begun to unlock some of the secrets of deep ocean pressure adaptations. Autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras and sophisticated sampling equipment can now spend months in the abyss, documenting the behavior of deep-sea creatures in their natural environment without the disturbance caused by large manned submersibles. These robotic explorers have revealed that the deep ocean is far more dynamic and ecologically complex than previously imagined, with active communities of organisms that migrate vertically through thousands of feet of water each day, following food sources and avoiding predators. The discovery of these vertical migrations, some covering distances equivalent to swimming from the surface to depths of several thousand feet twice daily, has revolutionized our understanding of deep ocean ecology. Creatures routinely experience pressure changes that would kill humans, yet they accomplish these journeys as part of their daily routine. Some species spend their days in the crushing depths of the abyss and their nights feeding near the surface, experiencing pressure changes equivalent to a human diving to the bottom of the deepest swimming pool and then ascending to the top of Mount Everest twice every 24 hours. This brings us to explore how organisms have mastered not just surviving at extreme pressure, but transitioning between radically different pressure environments as they move through the three-dimensional landscape of the ocean. Our understanding deepens when we consider the remarkable physiology that enables creatures to traverse the full depth range of the sea. The human body maintains its core temperature with remarkable precision, a feat that becomes extraordinary when we consider the thermal chaos surrounding us each day. Think about this for a moment. Your internal thermostat holds steady at 37 degrees Celsius, even as you move from air-conditioned rooms into scorching summer heat, from warm cars into freezing winter air. This temperature control system, evolved over millions of years, represents one of biology's most sophisticated engineering achievements. Yet like all systems, it has limits, and when those boundaries are crossed, the consequences unfold with both fascinating complexity and sobering finality. The story of hypothermia begins not with dramatic heat waves or medical emergencies, but with the quiet everyday miracle of thermal regulation. Your hypothalamus, a structure no larger than an almond nestled deep within your brain, serves as mission control for this operation. It receives constant updates from temperature sensors scattered throughout your body, some positioned just beneath your skin to monitor the outside world, others embedded in your internal organs to track your core. When these sensors detect even the slightest deviation from normal, the hypothalamus responds with swift precision. Consider what happens during a typical summer afternoon. As environmental temperature climbs, your peripheral thermoreceptors send increasingly urgent signals to the hypothalamic control center. Within moments, blood vessels near your skin surface begin to dilate, allowing more warm blood to flow close to the body's edge where heat can escape. Your heart rate increases to pump this blood more efficiently through this expanded network of surface vessels. Most remarkably, millions of sweat glands activate across your skin, each one a microscopic cooling tower releasing moisture that evaporates and carries heat away from your body. This process works beautifully under normal circumstances, but the system has built-in vulnerabilities that become apparent when we push beyond comfortable limits. The effectiveness of sweating, our primary cooling mechanism, depends entirely on the surrounding air's ability to absorb that moisture. In dry conditions, sweat evaporates rapidly, creating powerful cooling through the physics of phase change. Each gram of water that transitions from liquid to vapor pulls away approximately 2,400 joules of heat energy. But when humidity rises, this elegant system begins to falter. Here lies one of the most critical concepts in understanding human heat tolerance, the wet bulb temperature. This measurement, originally taken by wrapping a wet cloth around a thermometer, captures the complex interaction between heat and humidity that determines whether our bodies can successfully cool themselves. Traditional air temperature tells us only part of the story. A day with an air temperature of 46 degrees Celsius might be survivable in the desert where humidity remains low, allowing sweat to evaporate freely. But that same person might struggle dangerously at a seemingly milder 35 degrees Celsius if humidity reaches 100%. The wet bulb limit represents a fundamental boundary in human physiology. When wet bulb temperature reaches 35 degrees Celsius, equivalent to 35 degrees of dry heat with complete humidity, the human body loses its ability to cool itself through evaporation. At this threshold, sweat cannot evaporate from the skin surface because the surrounding air already holds all the moisture it can contain. The body continues producing sweat, but that moisture simply accumulates on the skin, providing no cooling benefit while contributing to dangerous dehydration. Recent research has revealed that this classical wet bulb limit of 35 degrees Celsius may actually overestimate human heat tolerance. Studies conducted at Pennsylvania State University, where young, healthy volunteers were exposed to controlled heat and humidity in laboratory chambers, suggest the true limit may be significantly lower. When researchers measured core body temperatures of participants under various heat and humidity combinations, they found that people began experiencing dangerous temperature rises at wet bulb temperatures as low as 31 degrees Celsius. These findings have profound implications because they suggest that deadly heat conditions may already be occurring more frequently than previously recognized. Climate scientists have identified at least 14 occasions since 1980 when wet bulb temperatures exceeded the theoretical 35-degree survival limit. These events, lasting up to 2 hours, occurred primarily in Pakistan's Indus River Valley and the coastal regions around the Persian Gulf. In cities like Jacobabad, Pakistan, this deadly threshold has been crossed 6 times, earning it recognition as one of the hottest places on Earth. The physiological cascade that unfolds when heat overwhelms the body's cooling capacity follows a predictable but accelerating pattern. Initially, as core temperature begins to rise above 37 degrees Celsius, the body responds by increasing heart rate and expanding blood flow to the skin. You might notice increased sweating, some fatigue, and perhaps a feeling of warmth that cannot be relieved by seeking shade. These represent the body's early warning system, signals that thermal balance is becoming precarious. As core temperature climbs toward 39 degrees Celsius, more concerning symptoms emerge. The cardiovascular system comes under increasing strain as it attempts to simultaneously supply blood to working muscles, vital organs, and the skin's cooling network. Blood pressure may drop as fluid is lost through profuse sweating. The person may experience headaches, nausea, or dizziness as the body struggles to maintain adequate blood flow to the brain while meeting the urgent demands of thermoregulation. When core temperature reaches 40 degrees Celsius, the body enters a state of heat exhaustion, a condition that represents the last stop before the more dangerous territory of heat stroke. At this stage, the person may feel confused, weak, or nauseated. Their skin might appear flushed and feel hot to the touch, though sweating often continues. This is the critical moment when immediate cooling intervention can prevent progression to a life-threatening condition. Heat stroke occurs when core temperature exceeds approximately 40 degrees Celsius, and the body's thermoregulatory mechanisms begin to fail catastrophically. The classical definition requires not just elevated temperature but also evidence of central nervous system dysfunction, including confusion, altered mental status, or loss of consciousness. At this point, cellular processes throughout the body begin to break down in ways that can quickly become irreversible. The cellular destruction that occurs during severe hypothermia reveals why high body temperature proves so dangerous. Proteins, the molecular machinery that powers every cellular process, begin to lose their precise three-dimensional structure when temperature climbs too high. This process, called denaturation, is familiar to anyone who has watched an egg white turn from clear liquid to opaque solid when heated. The same transformation occurs inside our cells, though with far more complex and devastating consequences. Critical enzymes that facilitate cellular respiration, energy production, and waste removal become non-functional as their protein structure unfolds. Cell membranes, composed of delicate lipid layers, begin to lose their integrity, allowing essential molecules to leak out while permitting harmful substances to enter. The cellular power plants, mitochondria, prove particularly vulnerable to heat damage, and their failure rapidly compromises the cell's ability to generate energy for survival. Different organs show varying susceptibility to heat damage, with the brain proving especially vulnerable. Neurons, having evolved for rapid electrical communication rather than heat tolerance, begin to malfunction as temperature rises above 41 degrees Celsius. The breakdown of the blood-brain barrier during severe hypothermia allows inflammatory molecules to enter brain tissue, triggering additional damage. This explains why altered mental status serves as one of the defining features of heat stroke, and why neurological complications can persist long after body temperature returns to normal. The cardiovascular system faces a different but equally challenging set of problems during extreme hypothermia. As the body attempts to cool itself by directing blood flow to the skin, less blood remains available for other vital organs. The heart must work dramatically harder to maintain circulation, often beating at rates exceeding 120 beats per minute even while the person remains at rest. The combination of increased cardiac workload and decreased blood volume due to sweating can precipitate cardiovascular collapse, particularly in older individuals or those with pre-existing heart conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, The human body possesses sophisticated mechanisms to protect itself from heat damage, systems that can sometimes allow survival under seemingly impossible conditions. Heat shock proteins represent one of biology's most ancient and effective protective strategies. When cells detect rising temperature, they rapidly begin producing these molecular chaperones, specialized proteins whose job involves refolding other proteins that have become damaged by heat. The heat shock response unfolds like a cellular emergency protocol. Within minutes of detecting thermal stress, cells begin synthesizing heat shock proteins at rates up to 50 times normal levels. These protective molecules work tirelessly to maintain cellular function, refolding damaged proteins, preventing harmful protein aggregation, and stabilizing cellular membranes. In essence, they buy time for the cell to survive until conditions improve. This protection system explains some of the most extraordinary cases of human heat survival on record. Willie Jones, a 52-year-old Atlanta man, holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the highest recorded body temperature. During a heat wave in July 1980, Jones was found in his apartment with a core temperature of 46.5 degrees Celsius, or 115.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Doctors expected him to die, as this temperature far exceeds what most medical textbooks consider survivable. Yet after 24 days of intensive care, Jones recovered completely with no apparent permanent damage. Jones's survival challenges our understanding of human thermal limits, while illustrating the remarkable variability in heat tolerance between individuals. His case suggests that under specific circumstances, perhaps involving rapid cooling and optimal medical care, humans can survive core temperatures that would normally prove fatal. However, such cases remain exceptional, and the factors that enabled his survival are not fully understood. The mechanisms underlying individual variation in heat tolerance continue to fascinate researchers. Some people appear naturally better equipped to handle thermal stress, showing more efficient sweating responses, superior cardiovascular adaptation to heat, or enhanced cellular protective mechanisms. Heat acclimatization, the physiological adaptation that occurs with repeated heat exposure over days or weeks, can dramatically improve survival prospects. Acclimatized individuals develop increased blood volume, more efficient sweating that begins at lower body temperatures, and enhanced cellular heat shock protein production. Age emerges as one of the most significant factors influencing heat tolerance. Young children prove particularly vulnerable because their thermoregulatory systems remain immature. The high surface area to body mass ratio makes them more susceptible to environmental temperature changes, and they depend on adults to recognize their distress and provide appropriate care. Older adults face different but equally serious challenges. Their sweat glands become less responsive with age, their cardiovascular systems may lack the reserve capacity needed for effective heat response, and medications commonly used by elderly individuals can interfere with normal thermoregulation. The intersection of hypothermia with other medical conditions creates particularly dangerous scenarios. Individuals with diabetes may have impaired sweating responses due to nerve damage caused by elevated blood sugar levels. Those with heart disease lack the cardiovascular reserve needed to maintain circulation during heat stress. People taking certain medications, including diuretics that promote fluid loss, anticholinergics that interfere with sweating, or beta blockers that limit heart rate response, face increased risk during heat waves. Perhaps most concerning are the growing number of environmental conditions where natural human heat tolerance proves insufficient regardless of individual physiology. As greenhouse gas concentrations continue rising in Earth's atmosphere, regions previously considered habitable are beginning to experience heat and humidity combinations that exceed human survival limits. Climate scientists project that by mid-century, parts of the Persian Gulf, northern India, and portions of China may regularly experience wet bulb temperatures above the human survival threshold during summer months. The implications extend far beyond individual health concerns. When environmental conditions exceed human tolerance, entire communities may become uninhabitable without artificial cooling. This reality already shapes daily life in some of the world's hottest cities, where outdoor work must cease during peak heat hours and air conditioning transforms from comfort to survival necessity. The growing frequency of power grid failures during extreme heat events creates life-threatening situations for vulnerable populations who lose access to cooling when they need it most. Research into the upper limits of human heat tolerance has revealed surprising complexity in how different types of heat affect survival. Dry heat, the kind experienced in desert climates, allows for much higher air temperatures than humid heat because sweating remains effective. The record for air temperature survival under dry conditions may have been set by Dr. Charles Blagden and his colleagues, who in 1775 spent 45 minutes in a room heated to 126 degrees Celsius without apparent harm. Their survival depended entirely on the extremely low humidity that allowed their natural cooling systems to function. Humid heat presents an entirely different challenge. When air contains high levels of water vapor, sweat cannot evaporate effectively regardless of air temperature. This explains why a muggy 86-degree day in Florida can feel more dangerous than a 120-degree day in Arizona. The body's cooling mechanisms become progressively less effective as humidity rises, creating thermal stress even at relatively moderate air temperatures. The study of extreme heat survival has revealed fascinating insights into cellular adaptation and the limits of biological systems. At the molecular level, the damage caused by hypothermia resembles what occurs during other forms of cellular stress, including oxygen deprivation and toxic exposure. Cells respond by activating similar protective pathways, suggesting that thermal tolerance may be linked to broader mechanisms of cellular resilience. Mitochondria, the cellular structures responsible for energy production, prove particularly vulnerable to heat damage. As temperature rises, these organelles begin to malfunction, reducing the cell's ability to generate the energy needed for survival. The resulting cellular energy crisis contributes to organ failure and ultimately death if temperatures remain elevated for extended periods. Understanding this process has led researchers to investigate whether medications that protect mitochondrial function might improve survival during severe hypothermia. The inflammatory response that accompanies severe heat stroke adds another layer of complexity to thermal injury. As cells throughout the body become damaged by high temperatures, they release molecular signals that trigger widespread inflammation. This response, intended to promote healing and clear away damaged tissue, can itself become harmful when it becomes too intense. The resulting inflammatory cascade contributes to organ failure and helps explain why some individuals continue to deteriorate even after their body temperature returns to normal. Recent advances in understanding the genetic basis of heat tolerance have revealed that some individuals may be born with advantages that improve their ability to survive thermal stress. Variations in genes controlling heat shock protein production, cardiovascular response to heat, and cellular protective mechanisms may partially explain why some people tolerate heat better than others. This genetic diversity, shaped by thousands of years of human adaptation to different climates, may become increasingly important as global temperatures continue to rise. The treatment of severe hypothermia requires rapid recognition and aggressive intervention to prevent irreversible damage. Emergency cooling techniques include immersing the person in ice water, applying cooling blankets, or using evaporative cooling methods that combine skin wetting with air circulation. The goal involves reducing core temperature as quickly as possible while supporting cardiovascular function and monitoring for complications. Modern medicine has developed sophisticated approaches to treating heat stroke that go well beyond simple cooling. Intravenous fluids help restore blood volume lost through sweating, while providing electrolytes needed for normal cellular function. Medications may be used to support blood pressure and heart function during the recovery period. In severe cases, treatments might include dialysis to support kidney function, or mechanical ventilation to assist breathing while the body recovers from thermal injury. The long-term consequences of severe hypothermia can persist for months or years after the initial incident. Neurological complications, including memory problems, coordination difficulties, or personality changes, may reflect permanent damage to heat-sensitive brain regions. Kidney damage from dehydration and cellular breakdown products can lead to chronic kidney disease. Heart muscle damage, similar to what occurs during a heart attack, may compromise cardiovascular function for years afterward. Prevention strategies for heat-related illness have evolved to incorporate our growing understanding of thermal physiology and environmental risk factors. Traditional recommendations to stay hydrated and seek shade remain important, but more sophisticated approaches now consider individual risk factors, environmental conditions, and activity levels. Heat warning systems that incorporate wet bulb temperature measurements provide more accurate assessments of danger than simple air temperature readings. The development of cooling technologies specifically designed for extreme heat survival has become an active area of innovation. Personal cooling devices, including evaporative cooling vests and circulating cooling systems, can extend safe working time in hot environments. Building design strategies that minimize heat gain while maximizing natural cooling can create survivable indoor conditions even when outdoor temperatures exceed human tolerance. Emergency preparedness for heat waves has become increasingly important as climate change intensifies the frequency and severity of extreme heat events. Communities vulnerable to power outages during heat waves have begun establishing cooling centers and developing protocols for checking on high-risk individuals. Public health agencies now track heat-related illness, with the same attention previously reserved for infectious disease outbreaks. The intersection of extreme heat with other climate change impacts creates particularly complex challenges for human survival. Wildfires, which have become more frequent and intense due to rising temperatures, can trap people in situations where they must choose between smoke exposure and heat exposure. Sea level rise may force coastal communities to relocate to inland areas that experience more extreme temperatures. Changes in precipitation patterns can disrupt water supplies needed for cooling and hydration during heat waves. Looking toward the future, the challenge of human survival in extreme heat will likely require both technological solutions and fundamental changes in how we organize society. Air conditioning, while providing effective protection against heat, requires enormous amounts of energy that can strain electrical grids and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. More sustainable approaches might include passive cooling techniques, changes in work schedules to avoid the hottest parts of the day, and urban design strategies that reduce heat accumulation in cities. The social dimensions of heat survival cannot be separated from the physiological ones. Heat waves disproportionately affect low-income communities, elderly individuals, and people with chronic medical conditions. These populations often lack access to air conditioning, live in housing that amplifies heat exposure, and may have limited ability to modify their activities during dangerous weather. Addressing heat survival thus requires attention to social equity and environmental justice, alongside medical and technological solutions. As our understanding of human thermal limits continues to evolve, new research questions emerge that may reshape how we think about heat survival. Scientists are investigating whether certain dietary interventions or medications might enhance heat tolerance by boosting cellular protective mechanisms. Others explore how physical conditioning programs might improve the body's ability to cope with thermal stress. Still others examine whether genetic variations that improve heat tolerance might be enhanced through emerging medical technologies. The study of extreme heat survival also provides insights into the remarkable resilience of biological systems and the conditions under which life can persist. The fact that humans can survive core temperatures approaching 47 degrees Celsius, conditions that would denature most proteins in a test tube, speaks to the sophisticated protective mechanisms that evolution has provided. Understanding these systems may inform not only heat survival, but also research into aging, disease resistance, and the fundamental limits of biological adaptation. The cellular and molecular mechanisms that protect against heat damage continue to reveal surprises that challenge our assumptions about biological limits. Heat shock proteins, originally discovered as a response to elevated temperature, are now known to protect cells against various forms of stress, including oxidative damage, toxic exposure, and age-related deterioration. This suggests that strategies for improving heat tolerance might also enhance overall health and longevity. The phenomenon of hormesis, where mild stress can improve an organism's resistance to more severe challenges, appears to play a role in heat adaptation. People who experience regular mild heat stress, such as those who use saunas or live in warm climates, often show improved tolerance to more extreme temperatures. This adaptive response involves not just immediate physiological changes, but also longer-term modifications in gene expression that enhance cellular protective capacity. As we continue to push the boundaries of human knowledge about thermal survival, Each discovery reveals new layers of complexity in the relationship between heat and life. The human body's response to extreme temperature represents millions of years of evolutionary refinement, yet it also reflects the constraints and compromises inherent in biological systems. Understanding these limits helps us prepare for a future where extreme heat may become an increasingly common challenge for human civilization. This brings us to explore how our understanding deepens when we consider the fascinating world of human adaptation to extreme cold, where the body faces an entirely different set of survival challenges and employs equally remarkable protective strategies. Picture yourself taking a deep breath. In that moment, 20.9% of the air entering your lungs is oxygen, that essential molecule that powers virtually every cell in your body. Yet this abundance we take for granted becomes a precious commodity as we venture higher into the atmosphere. The relationship between humans and oxygen deprivation reveals one of biology's most elegant survival stories, where cellular intelligence meets evolutionary adaptation in ways that continue to astound researchers today. The human brain, representing just 2% of our body weight, demands approximately 20% of our total oxygen supply. This remarkable organ begins to show signs of distress within mere seconds when oxygen levels drop below critical thresholds. Think about that for a moment. At 18% oxygen, the effects remain largely imperceptible. But as concentrations fall to 15%, the equivalent of standing at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, our mental performance begins to falter in subtle yet measurable ways. Reaction times slow, decision-making becomes clouded, and the sharp edge of cognitive function starts to dull. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is how rapidly the effects cascade. Between 30 and 180 seconds of severe oxygen deprivation, consciousness begins to slip away like sand through fingers. At the 1-minute mark, brain cells begin their irreversible journey toward death. By 3 minutes, neurons suffer extensive damage that may leave lasting scars on the intricate network of human consciousness. At 5 minutes, death becomes an imminent threat. 10 minutes marks the threshold where even if life persists, the likelihood of coma and permanent brain damage becomes almost inevitable. Yet within this seemingly grim timeline lies one of nature's most remarkable exceptions. Freedivers routinely push these boundaries, with current records reaching an astounding 24 minutes and 3 seconds underwater without sustaining brain damage. This achievement represents more than human determination. It reveals the extraordinary plasticity of our physiological systems when properly trained and conditioned. The story of oxygen deprivation cannot be told without understanding the elegant molecular machinery that governs our cellular response to low oxygen conditions. Deep within each of our cells lies a sophisticated sensing system that detects oxygen levels with remarkable precision. At the heart of this system are hypoxia-inducible factors, master regulators that act as cellular emergency coordinators when oxygen supplies dwindle. Under normal conditions, these transcription factors face constant destruction. Prylyl hydroxylase enzymes, acting like molecular scissors, modify these proteins in an oxygen-dependent manner, marking them for degradation by the cell's recycling machinery. But when oxygen levels drop, these molecular scissors lose their cutting edge. The hypoxia-inducible factors accumulate, translocate into the cell's nucleus, and begin orchestrating a symphony of survival responses. This cellular switch activates genes controlling everything from red blood cell production to blood vessel formation. It triggers increased production of erythropoietin, the hormone responsible for stimulating bone marrow to create more oxygen-carrying red blood cells. It promotes the formation of new blood vessels through angiogenesis, creating alternate pathways for oxygen delivery. Perhaps most remarkably, it coordinates a metabolic shift from oxygen-dependent energy production to anaerobic processes, allowing cells to continue functioning even when oxygen supplies are scarce. The discovery of this pathway, recognized with the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, has opened unprecedented insights into how life adapts to one of its most fundamental challenges. These hypoxia-inducible factors represent evolution's solution to the oxygen paradox, the delicate balance between harnessing oxygen's energy potential while avoiding its destructive oxidative effects. The mountains have always called to human explorers, but they also serve as natural laboratories for understanding oxygen deprivation. As we ascend, barometric pressure decreases in a predictable pattern. At 5,000 meters, roughly the altitude of Everest Base Camp, the partial pressure of oxygen drops to about half its sea level value. At 8,848 meters, the summit of Mount Everest, oxygen availability plummets to just 1/3 of what we experience at sea level. For most humans, the effects begin to manifest around 2,100 meters above sea level, where the saturation of oxyhemoglobin starts its rapid decline. The body's initial response is immediate and dramatic. Breathing rate increases as peripheral chemoreceptors detect falling oxygen levels and signal the respiratory centers to work harder. Heart rate accelerates as the sympathetic nervous system responds to the physiological stress of oxygen scarcity. Blood vessels in the lungs constrict in a process called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, an attempt to redirect blood flow to better oxygenated areas of the lung. But these rapid responses represent only the opening movement of a much longer symphony of adaptation. Over days and weeks, the body orchestrates more profound changes. Red blood cell production increases dramatically, with erythropoietin levels peaking within the first 2 to 3 days of altitude exposure. The blood becomes thicker, more viscous, as it carries a higher concentration of oxygen transport vehicles. Capillary density increases in muscle tissue, creating more efficient pathways for oxygen delivery to working cells. The discovery of these mechanisms owes much to pioneering research conducted during World War II. Operation Everest, sponsored by the United States Navy in 1946, systematically documented the physiological changes that occur during slow ascent to 29,000 feet. The study revealed that humans could tolerate extreme hypoxia only through enormous increases in ventilation, resulting in alveolar carbon dioxide pressures as low as 7.5 torr on Everest's summit and arterial pH values climbing above 7.7. Even under these extreme adaptations, arterial oxygen pressure on the summit drops below 30 torr, and maximum oxygen uptake falls to approximately 1 liter per minute. The margin between survival and death becomes razor thin, measured not in comfort zones, but in the precise calibration of every physiological system working at its absolute limit. The most remarkable chapter in the story of human adaptation to oxygen deprivation is written not by occasional mountain climbers, but by entire populations who have made their homes in the thin air of high-altitude environments. An estimated 81.6 million people live at elevations above 2,500 meters, with 21.7 million in Ethiopia, 12.5 million in China, 11.7 million in Colombia, 7.8 million in Peru, and 6.2 million in Bolivia. These populations represent 3 distinct evolutionary experiments in high-altitude adaptation, each following remarkably different paths to the same goal of survival in oxygen-poor environments. The Tibetans of the Himalayan plateau, the Andean peoples of South America, and the Amhara of Ethiopia have each developed unique physiological solutions to the challenge of chronic hypoxia. Tibetan highlanders present perhaps the most elegant solution. Rather than simply increasing red blood cell production like lowlanders who ascend to altitude, Tibetans maintain hemoglobin levels similar to sea level populations. Their adaptation lies elsewhere, in enhanced lung capacity, increased nitric oxide production that promotes blood vessel dilation, and more efficient oxygen utilization at the cellular level. Women with genetic variants associated with higher blood oxygen content show dramatically improved reproductive success, with lower infant mortality rates providing clear evidence of natural selection at work. The genetic basis of these adaptations has revealed fascinating insights into human evolution. The strongest signal of natural selection appears in the EPAS1 gene, which shows a 78% frequency difference between Tibetan and mainland Chinese populations. This represents the fastest genetic change observed in any human gene to date, occurring over approximately 3,000 years of high-altitude living. The gene encodes a transcription factor involved in hypoxia response, directly linking the molecular machinery of oxygen sensing to evolutionary adaptation. Andean populations tell a different story. Their adaptation relies more heavily on increased hemoglobin concentration and red blood cell production, similar to the response seen in lowlanders ascending to altitude. However, their red blood cells carry more oxygen per unit volume, creating more efficient oxygen transport throughout the body. They also develop enlarged lung volumes and increased alveolar surface area, maximizing the interface between air and blood for gas exchange. Ethiopian highlanders represent a third pathway, with adaptations that appear to focus on maintaining oxygen delivery despite reduced oxygen availability. Their physiological responses combine elements seen in both Tibetan and Andean populations, while adding unique characteristics of their own. These population studies reveal the remarkable flexibility of human physiology when evolutionary pressure operates over sufficient timescales. They also highlight how multiple solutions can emerge for the same environmental challenge, each reflecting the complex interplay between genetics, development, and environmental factors. The cellular response to oxygen deprivation involves a delicate balance between survival and death. When oxygen levels drop to between 0.5 and 3%, cells activate sophisticated survival pathways. Hypoxia-inducible factors trigger metabolic reprogramming, shifting energy production from efficient but oxygen-dependent mitochondrial respiration to less efficient but oxygen-independent glycolysis. This metabolic flexibility allows cells to continue functioning even when oxygen supplies are critically low. However, when oxygen levels fall below 0.5%, entering the realm of anoxia, the cellular survival mechanisms become overwhelmed. Under these conditions, cells begin committing to programmed cell death through apoptosis. The mitochondria, normally the powerhouse of cellular energy production, become sites of destruction as their membranes lose integrity and release cytochrome C, triggering the cellular death cascade. Interestingly, this process requires energy in the form of ATP to complete the organized destruction of the cell. In anoxic conditions where oxidative phosphorylation cannot occur, cells must rely on glycolytic ATP production to fuel their own demise. If both glucose and oxygen are absent, cells cannot even manage organized death and instead undergo necrosis, a more chaotic form of cellular destruction. The brain shows particular vulnerability to oxygen deprivation, with different regions displaying varying sensitivity. Some neurons begin dying within 5 minutes of oxygen loss, while others may survive longer. The pattern of damage often reflects the brain's hierarchy of oxygen demand, with regions responsible for consciousness and higher cognitive functions showing earlier and more severe effects than areas controlling basic life functions like breathing and heart rate. Modern research has revealed that the brain's response to hypoxia involves complex changes at the molecular level. Hypoxia triggers alterations in DNA methylation and histone acetylation, epigenetic changes that can persist long after oxygen levels are restored. These modifications influence which genes are turned on or off, potentially affecting brain function for extended periods following the initial hypoxic insult. The relationship between oxygen deprivation and brain function extends beyond acute effects. Chronic exposure to mild hypoxia, such as that experienced by people with sleep apnea or certain cardiovascular conditions, can lead to subtle but cumulative changes in cognitive function. The brain adapts to these conditions by increasing blood vessel density and altering neurotransmitter systems, but these adaptations may come at the cost of optimal performance. Recent advances in understanding oxygen sensing have revealed surprising connections between hypoxia and other biological processes. The circadian clock, our internal 24-hour timing system, shows intricate connections with hypoxia-inducible factors. This makes biological sense, as oxygen demand fluctuates throughout the day with activity patterns, and the cellular machinery that responds to oxygen availability must coordinate with other temporal regulatory systems. The discovery of this circadian hypoxia connection has implications far beyond basic biology. Shift workers, who routinely disrupt their natural sleep-wake cycles, may experience altered hypoxia responses that could affect everything from wound healing to cancer risk. Athletes who train at high altitude may need to consider not just the oxygen deprivation effects, but also how these interact with their natural circadian rhythms. Environmental oxygen deprivation extends far beyond mountain climbing or athletic training. In many occupational settings, workers face reduced oxygen environments. Mining operations, particularly at high-altitude locations, present complex challenges where both reduced barometric pressure and potential displacement of oxygen by other gases create hazardous conditions. The mining industry has had to develop sophisticated monitoring and life support systems to protect workers in these environments. Similarly, aviation presents unique challenges related to oxygen deprivation. Commercial aircraft maintain cabin pressure equivalent to altitudes of 6,000 to 8,000 feet, requiring careful balance between passenger comfort and the engineering constraints of pressurized flight. Military and research pilots operating at extreme altitudes require supplemental oxygen systems and extensive training to recognize and respond to hypoxia symptoms. The study of oxygen deprivation has led to innovative therapeutic approaches. Controlled exposure to mild hypoxia, sometimes called hypoxic training or intermittent hypoxic exposure, is being investigated as a treatment for various conditions. The principle underlying these approaches is that brief, controlled episodes of oxygen deprivation can trigger beneficial adaptations without causing harmful effects. Some research suggests that intermittent hypoxic exposure might improve cardiovascular function, enhance cognitive performance, and even slow aging processes. The mechanisms appear to involve activation of the same hypoxia-inducible factor pathways that govern high-altitude adaptation, but in a controlled manner that maximizes benefits while minimizing risks. However, the line between beneficial adaptation and harmful deprivation remains critically important. The difference between therapeutic hypoxia and dangerous oxygen deprivation can be measured not just in oxygen levels, but in duration, individual susceptibility, and the presence of other risk factors. This precision requirement has made clinical applications challenging to develop and implement safely. The field of hypoxia research has been revolutionized by advances in molecular biology and imaging technology. Scientists can now observe hypoxia-inducible factor activation in real time, track oxygen levels in individual cells, and map the precise patterns of oxygen distribution in living tissues. These tools have revealed that oxygen availability varies dramatically even within single organs, creating microenvironments with distinct hypoxic signatures. Cancer research has particularly benefited from these advances. Tumours often create their own hypoxic environments as they outgrow their blood supply. Understanding how cancer cells adapt to oxygen deprivation has led to new therapeutic strategies that either exploit the hypoxic environment to selectively target tumour cells or prevent tumours from adapting to low oxygen conditions. The study of tumour hypoxia has revealed that cancer cells often hijack the same survival mechanisms that allow normal cells to adapt to oxygen deprivation. Hypoxia-inducible factors, normally protective in healthy tissues, can promote tumour growth by triggering blood vessel formation and metabolic changes that favour cancer cell survival. This knowledge has led to the development of drugs that specifically inhibit hypoxia-inducible factor activity in tumours, while preserving their beneficial functions in normal tissues. Understanding oxygen deprivation has profound implications for critical care medicine. Patients in intensive care units often experience various forms of hypoxia, whether from lung disease, heart failure, or other conditions that impair oxygen delivery. The insights gained from high-altitude research and cellular hypoxia studies are being translated into better monitoring techniques, more effective ventilation strategies, and novel therapeutic interventions. The concept of taking knowledge from the mountainside to the bedside has driven numerous research initiatives. Studying healthy individuals at high altitude provides insights into hypoxic adaptation that can inform treatment strategies for critically ill patients. The advantage of this approach is that high-altitude research involves willing participants in relatively controlled conditions, providing ethical and practical advantages over direct experimentation with hospitalized patients. Recent research has also revealed connections between oxygen deprivation and mental health. Chronic mild hypoxia, such as that experienced by people living at moderate altitudes or those with certain medical conditions, may influence mood, cognitive function, and even personality traits. The brain regions responsible for emotion regulation show particular sensitivity to oxygen availability, and alterations in these areas might contribute to conditions like depression and anxiety. The relationship between altitude and mental health is complex and bidirectional. While some people report improved mood and well-being at high altitude, possibly related to increased sunlight exposure and physical activity, others experience altitude-related mood changes that may persist even after returning to sea level. These effects likely reflect individual variations in hypoxia sensitivity and adaptation capacity. As our understanding of oxygen deprivation deepens, new questions continue to emerge. Why do some individuals adapt more readily to hypoxic conditions than others? What role do genetic factors play in determining hypoxia sensitivity? How do age, sex, and other demographic factors influence oxygen deprivation responses? These questions drive ongoing research that continues to reveal new layers of complexity in the relationship between humans and oxygen availability. The study of extreme environments has always pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, and oxygen deprivation research exemplifies this tradition. From the early high-altitude expeditions that documented basic physiological responses to modern molecular studies that map cellular adaptation pathways, each advance in understanding has opened new avenues for exploration and application. The implications extend beyond human health to broader questions about life on Earth and potentially beyond. Understanding how organisms adapt to low oxygen environments provides insights into early Earth conditions when atmospheric oxygen was much lower than today. It also informs speculation about life on other planets where oxygen availability might differ dramatically from terrestrial conditions. The technological advances that have emerged from oxygen deprivation research find applications far beyond their original scope. Oxygen concentrators developed for high-altitude facilities are now used in medical settings worldwide. Monitoring systems designed to track oxygen levels in extreme environments have been adapted for use in hospitals, research laboratories, and industrial settings. The knowledge gained from studying human adaptation to oxygen deprivation continues to drive innovation across multiple fields. Perhaps most remarkably, the story of oxygen deprivation reveals the extraordinary resilience and adaptability of life itself. From the molecular machinery that senses oxygen availability in individual cells, to the evolutionary adaptations that allow entire populations to thrive in oxygen-poor environments, life has developed remarkably sophisticated solutions to one of its most fundamental challenges. The intricate dance between oxygen availability and cellular function reflects billions of years of evolutionary refinement. Every breath we take represents the culmination of this evolutionary process, from the earliest organisms that learned to harness oxygen's energy potential to the complex multicellular organisms that have mastered the delicate balance between oxygen utilization and oxygen toxicity. As we continue to explore the limits of human performance and adaptation, the study of oxygen deprivation remains at the forefront of physiological research. New technologies, emerging therapeutic approaches, and deeper understanding of molecular mechanisms promise to reveal even more about this fundamental aspect of human biology. The mountains continue to call, not just to adventurers seeking personal achievement, but to researchers seeking to understand the remarkable capabilities and limitations of the human body. Each expedition to high altitude, each study of adapted populations, and each investigation of cellular hypoxia responses adds another piece to the complex puzzle of human survival in oxygen-challenged environments. The knowledge we gain from these endeavors extends far beyond the immediate applications. Understanding oxygen deprivation provides insights into aging, disease, athletic performance, and the fundamental processes that maintain life itself. It reveals how the human body represents a masterpiece of biological engineering, capable of adapting to challenges that would have seemed insurmountable from the perspective of earlier evolutionary stages. This brings us to explore how the intricate mechanisms of oxygen sensing and cellular adaptation connect with the broader networks of human physiology, revealing how our bodies maintain the delicate balance between all the essential elements that sustain life. The human body exists as a delicate balance of pressures, temperatures, and chemical reactions, all carefully orchestrated by millions of years of evolution to thrive within Earth's protective atmosphere. Yet what happens when we venture beyond this familiar envelope of air and warmth into the absolute vacuum of space represents one of the most fascinating intersections of human physiology and the extreme physics of our universe. The story of how our bodies respond to the void reveals both our remarkable resilience and our fundamental dependence on the thin layer of gases that surround our planet. When we think about space, our imagination often conjures dramatic images from science fiction films. Bodies exploding violently or instantly freezing solid in the cosmic emptiness. These dramatic portrayals, while visually striking, miss the more subtle and scientifically fascinating reality of what actually occurs when human tissue encounters the vacuum of space. The truth is both more forgiving and more complex than Hollywood suggests, involving a cascade of physiological responses that unfold over precious seconds and minutes rather than instantaneous catastrophe. The fundamental challenge begins with pressure, or rather, the complete absence of it. At sea level, our bodies exist under the constant embrace of atmospheric pressure, roughly 14.7 pounds pressing down on every square inch of our surface. This pressure isn't merely sitting atop us, it permeates through our tissues, dissolved in our blood, filling the spaces between our cells. Our entire circulatory system, our lungs, our cellular processes have all evolved to function within this pressurized environment. Remove that pressure suddenly, and the intricate balance begins to shift in ways both predictable and surprising. The moment a human body encounters true vacuum, the first response isn't explosion or freezing, but rather a much more subtle process called ebulism. This elegant scientific term describes the spontaneous transformation of liquid water within our tissues into water vapor when ambient pressure drops below a critical threshold. At body temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, water possesses what physicists call a vapor pressure, a natural tendency to become gas. Normally, atmospheric pressure keeps this tendency in check, but when external pressure vanishes, water begins its phase transition from liquid to vapor right within our living tissues. This threshold, known as the Armstrong limit after Air Force flight surgeon Harry George Armstrong, occurs at an altitude of approximately 63,000 feet above Earth's surface, where atmospheric pressure drops to just 47 millimeters of mercury. At this point, the vapor pressure of water at body temperature equals the ambient pressure, and exposed body fluids begin to boil, not with the violent bubbling we might see in a kettle, but with a gentle, almost ethereal transformation as molecules of water spontaneously become gas. Think about that for a moment. The moisture on your tongue, the tears in your eyes, the fluid coating the delicate air sacs of your lungs, all begin to vaporize at body temperature. The effect is immediate but localized initially to surfaces exposed to the vacuum. Jim LeBlanc, a NASA technician who accidentally experienced suit decompression during a 1966 vacuum chamber test, recalled the peculiar sensation of saliva boiling on his tongue as his last conscious memory before losing consciousness. The experience, he noted, was more strange than painful, a fizzing sensation as the moisture in his mouth transformed to vapor in the space of seconds. But ebulism extends far beyond these surface effects. As pressure drops to vacuum levels, water vapor begins forming throughout the body's tissues, particularly in areas where pressure is naturally lower. The phenomenon creates microscopic bubbles of water vapor in soft tissues, beneath the skin, and most critically within the circulatory system. These vapor bubbles don't cause the body to explode like an overfilled balloon, as our tissues possess remarkable elasticity and porosity. Instead, they cause swelling, potentially doubling the body's volume while creating what researchers have described as the appearance of an inflated leather bag. The swelling itself tells a story of biological engineering. Our skin, evolved to contain and protect, proves surprisingly capable of accommodating this dramatic expansion without rupturing. The protein fibers of collagen and elastin that give our skin its strength and flexibility can stretch to accommodate the vapor formation, though the process is far from comfortable. In animal studies conducted during the early space program, researchers observed that subjects could swell dramatically, yet return to normal size once pressure was restored, suggesting that our biological materials possess an inherent tolerance for these extreme conditions that we're only beginning to understand. Yet the most immediate threat isn't swelling or tissue damage, but rather the interruption of the one process we cannot survive without for more than minutes, the delivery of oxygen to our brain. In normal circumstances, our lungs extract oxygen from the air and dissolve it into our bloodstream, where it travels to every cell in our body. The vacuum of space reverses this process entirely. Instead of absorbing oxygen, our lungs begin expelling all gases dissolved in our blood, including the precious oxygen our brain cells desperately need to maintain consciousness and life. This reversal happens with startling rapidity. Within 9 to 12 seconds, the deoxygenated blood that has given up its oxygen to the vacuum reaches the brain, and consciousness begins to fade. The Federal Aviation Administration notes that humans retain full mental capacity for perhaps 9 to 12 seconds after vacuum exposure, though the exact timeline varies with individual physiology and circumstances. During these precious seconds, a person retains the ability to take action, to activate emergency systems, to attempt rescue procedures. Beyond this narrow window, unconsciousness arrives as oxygen reserves in the bloodstream become exhausted. The progression that follows unconsciousness follows a predictable but alarming sequence. First comes paralysis as the nervous system, deprived of oxygen, begins shutting down non-essential functions. This is followed by generalized convulsions as neural systems fire erratically in response to oxygen deprivation, then a return to paralysis as the brain's electrical activity becomes increasingly disorganized. The heart, that remarkably resilient muscle that can continue beating even when separated from the body, begins to slow its rhythm. Blood pressure drops precipitously as the cardiovascular system struggles to maintain circulation through tissues swollen with vapor bubbles. During this process, the continuous evaporation of water from the lungs, mouth, and nasal passages creates an intense cooling effect. The phase transition from liquid water to water vapor requires energy, specifically heat energy, which gets absorbed from surrounding tissues. This evaporative cooling can drop the temperature of the mouth and nasal passages to near freezing within the first minute of vacuum exposure. Ice crystals may form on the tongue and in the respiratory tract, creating a frost-like coating on these delicate tissues. Yet paradoxically, the rest of the body doesn't freeze rapidly because vacuum is an excellent insulator. Without air molecules to conduct heat away from the body, core temperature drops slowly, primarily through radiation to the 3 Kelvin background temperature of space. The timeline of survival in vacuum has been established through a combination of animal studies and unfortunate human accidents. Research conducted during the 1950s and 60s, much of it using animals as test subjects, revealed that exposure to near vacuum conditions for up to 90 seconds typically allowed for complete recovery once pressure was restored. The 90-second threshold appears to be crucial. Beyond this point, even if the heart continues beating at the moment of repressurization, death becomes increasingly likely. The cascade of cellular damage from prolonged oxygen deprivation, combined with the mechanical effects of vapor bubble formation throughout the body's tissues, creates injuries that are difficult for the body to overcome. Yet, survival stories exist that stretch even these parameters. One remarkable case involved an industrial worker accidentally exposed to vacuum in a chamber who remained unconscious for 2 to 3 minutes before repressurization. While he required intensive medical care and suffered cardiac arrest during the ordeal, medical teams managed to revive him through CPR, and he eventually recovered full function. Such cases suggest that the human body possesses reserves of resilience that we're still discovering, though they also demonstrate that extended vacuum exposure pushes biological systems far beyond their design limits. The physiological mechanisms underlying both survival and death in vacuum conditions reveal the intricate interconnectedness of our biological systems. The formation of vapor bubbles in the bloodstream creates what's essentially a vapor lock in our circulation, similar to what might occur in a car's fuel system. The heart continues trying to pump blood, but the presence of vapor bubbles throughout the circulatory system means that blood flow becomes increasingly ineffective. Tissues begin experiencing what physicians call ischemia, a lack of blood flow that rapidly leads to cellular damage and death. Simultaneously, the lungs, those remarkable organs that normally expand and contract to draw air into our bodies, begin collapsing as all gases are expelled into the vacuum, yet they continue releasing water vapor, creating a pathway for heat loss that rapidly chills the respiratory tract. The continuous outflow of gas and vapor through the mouth and nose accelerates the cooling process, creating the near-freezing temperatures that frost the mouth and throat within the first critical minute. The brain, consuming roughly 20% of our body's total oxygen supply under normal conditions, proves exquisitely sensitive to the oxygen interruption that vacuum exposure creates. Within seconds of oxygen cessation, neural activity begins changing. The complex electrical patterns that generate consciousness, memory, and thought start becoming disorganized. Yet remarkably, if oxygen can be restored within the critical time window, normal brain function typically returns without permanent damage. This suggests that the brain possesses protective mechanisms that can preserve essential functions during brief periods of extreme oxygen deprivation. Perhaps most fascinating is how these discoveries emerged from both planned research and serendipitous accidents. The early space program necessitated understanding human limits in low-pressure environments, leading to extensive animal testing that provided the foundational knowledge of vacuum exposure effects. Yet some of the most valuable insights came from accidents like Jim LeBlanc's 1966 suit failure, where human subjects inadvertently provided data about the actual experience of decompression that no ethical experiment could have generated. The testing revealed details that pure theory couldn't predict. Animals exposed to near-vacuum conditions exhibited not just the expected unconsciousness and swelling, but also involuntary evacuation of bowels and bladders, projectile vomiting, and massive seizures. Their tongues often became coated with ice, and they swelled to remarkable proportions. Yet when pressure was restored within the critical 90-second window, these dramatic effects reversed with surprising completeness. Within 10 to 15 minutes of repressurization, test animals could walk, though temporary blindness often persisted for additional minutes or hours. These experiments, conducted primarily with dogs and chimpanzees, painted a picture of biological resilience that surprised researchers. The body's ability to recover from such extreme physiological disruption suggested that evolution had provided mammals with remarkable tolerance for pressure variations, perhaps as an adaptation to diving behaviors or altitude changes that our ancestors might have experienced. The temporary nature of most effects, including the blindness that often accompanied vacuum exposure, indicated that even neural tissues could recover from brief periods of extreme stress. The implications extend beyond academic curiosity into practical questions of space exploration and safety. Modern spacecraft and spacesuits are designed with multiple redundancies precisely because the consequences of pressure loss are so severe. Yet understanding the actual timeline and mechanisms of vacuum exposure has informed rescue protocols, equipment design, and emergency procedures that could mean the difference between life and death for future space travelers. Consider the engineering challenges this knowledge has influenced. Current spacesuits operate at pressures of roughly 4.3 pounds per square inch for American suits and 5.7 pounds per square inch for Russian Orlan suits. These pressures represent a careful balance between providing enough pressure to prevent embolism while maintaining enough flexibility for astronauts to work effectively. Higher pressure suits offer greater safety margins, but become increasingly difficult to move in, rather like trying to bend an overly inflated balloon compared to a softer one. Researchers explored even lower pressure suit designs, including experimental suits operating at 3.5 pounds per square inch using argon-oxygen mixtures. The logic follows that since embolism severity depends partly on the absolute pressure change experienced during decompression, a suit operating at lower internal pressure would subject its wearer to less severe decompression effects if catastrophic pressure loss occurred. Yet such designs push closer to the physiological limits, requiring careful consideration of the trade-offs between mobility, safety, and the risk of embolism onset. The Space Shuttle program introduced an elegant solution in the form of the Crew Altitude Protection Suit, a fitted elastic garment designed to prevent embolism even at pressures as low as 2 kilopascals, roughly 15 millimeters of mercury. The suit worked by providing external pressure on the body's surface, counteracting the tendency for vapor bubbles to form in tissues. This approach demonstrated that mechanical compression could substitute for atmospheric pressure in preventing the most dangerous effects of vacuum exposure, opening possibilities for lighter, more flexible protective systems. Yet the most sobering reminder of vacuum's dangers comes from the only known fatalities from space vacuum exposure: the 3 Soviet cosmonauts aboard Soyuz 11 in 1971. During their return from humanity's first space station, a pressure equalization valve accidentally opened at an altitude of 168 kilometers above Earth. The cabin atmosphere vented into space over approximately 30 seconds while one crew member attempted to manually close the valve. When ground crews reached the landed capsule, they found all 3 cosmonauts in what was described as appearing to sleep, having died from vacuum exposure during their descent through space. This tragedy illustrated both the unforgiving nature of vacuum exposure and the critical importance of the time factor. 30 seconds proved sufficient for fatal decompression, even though laboratory studies suggested that timelines should have allowed for survival. The difference likely lay in factors such as the stress of the emergency situation, the physical effort required to attempt repairs, and the particular dynamics of gradual versus sudden pressure loss. The incident led to significant changes in spacecraft design and crew procedures, emphasizing that theoretical survival times must be viewed as absolute maximums rather than comfortable margins. The physics underlying these biological responses reveals fundamental principles about pressure, phase transitions, and the behavior of complex biological systems under extreme conditions. When pressure drops below the vapor pressure of water at body temperature, thermodynamics demands that liquid water transform to vapor. This isn't a matter of biological adaptation or individual tolerance. It's as inevitable as water boiling in a kettle, though occurring at body temperature when pressure becomes sufficiently low. The energy requirements of this phase transition drive the cooling effects observed in vacuum exposure. Converting liquid water to water vapor requires approximately 540 calories per gram of water, energy that must come from somewhere. In a body exposed to vacuum, this energy comes from the heat contained within tissues, creating the rapid cooling that forms ice crystals in the mouth and respiratory tract. The process is essentially the same as the evaporative cooling that makes perspiration effective for temperature regulation, though occurring at a vastly accelerated pace under vacuum conditions. The formation of vapor bubbles throughout body tissues follows similar physical principles to those governing decompression sickness in deep-sea divers. In both cases, dissolved gases come out of solution when pressure drops, though the mechanisms differ slightly. Divers primarily deal with nitrogen dissolved in blood and tissues under high-pressure conditions, while vacuum exposure involves water vapor formation throughout the body. Both create gas bubbles that can disrupt normal circulation and cellular function, though the timeline and severity differ dramatically between the 2 scenarios. Understanding these mechanisms has informed not just spacecraft design, but also high-altitude aviation, where similar though less extreme pressure challenges exist. Military pilots flying at altitudes above 50,000 feet face pressure environments that begin approaching the Armstrong limit, requiring pressure suits or pressurized cockpits to maintain safety. The lessons learned from vacuum exposure research have contributed to everything from ejection seat design to emergency oxygen systems that could preserve life during catastrophic aircraft decompression at extreme altitudes. The research has also illuminated broader questions about life's limits and adaptability. The discovery that mammals can survive brief vacuum exposure with complete recovery suggests that biological systems possess remarkable tolerance for extreme environmental variations. This resilience likely reflects evolutionary adaptations that served our ancestors well when facing dramatic environmental changes, though probably not vacuum conditions specifically. The mechanisms that allow cells and tissues to recover from vapor bubble formation and severe oxygen deprivation may represent fundamental properties of complex biological systems that extend beyond just pressure tolerance. Consider how this knowledge reshapes our understanding of the boundary between life and death. The traditional view might suggest that exposure to the vacuum of space represents an instantly fatal condition, beyond any hope of survival. Yet the research reveals a more nuanced picture where survival depends critically on timing, with outcomes ranging from complete recovery to inevitable death, based primarily on whether rescue occurs within the first 90 seconds of exposure. This narrow window represents both human fragility and remarkable resilience, existing simultaneously within the same biological system. The psychological aspects of vacuum exposure add another layer of complexity to this scientific understanding. The few humans who have experienced accidental decompression report that the process, while frightening, is not immediately painful in the way one might expect. The boiling of saliva on the tongue creates an unusual sensation described as fizzing or bubbling, but not intense pain. The loss of consciousness that follows within seconds likely prevents the experience of more severe symptoms that develop during extended exposure. This suggests that while vacuum exposure would be terrifying psychologically, the physical experience may be less traumatic than dramatic portrayals suggest. The implications extend to long-term space exploration, where understanding human limits in extreme environments becomes crucial for mission planning and safety protocol development. Mars missions, lunar bases, and extended deep space voyages will all involve humans living and working in environments where catastrophic pressure loss remains a constant possibility. The knowledge gained from vacuum exposure research provides the foundation for emergency procedures, equipment design, and training programs that could preserve life when facing the ultimate environmental challenge. Recent advances in materials science and biomedical engineering have opened new possibilities for protective systems that go beyond traditional pressure suits. Researchers have explored mechanical counter-pressure garments that could provide protection through direct compression rather than surrounding the body with pressurized air. Such systems could potentially offer protection equivalent to current spacesuits while providing greater mobility and reduced complexity, though they remain largely experimental. The study of vacuum exposure has also contributed to medical understanding of conditions like decompression sickness, air embolism, and even some aspects of cardiac arrest and resuscitation. The mechanisms that allow recovery from brief periods of complete circulatory disruption in vacuum conditions have informed approaches to treating various medical emergencies where blood flow and oxygenation are compromised. The research has provided insights into cellular tolerance for oxygen deprivation and the timeframes within which irreversible damage occurs. As our species continues expanding into space, the lessons learned from understanding human responses to vacuum exposure become increasingly relevant. The International Space Station, with its multiple pressure barriers and emergency protocols, reflects decades of learning about pressure loss risks and survival strategies. Future spacecraft designed for Mars exploration incorporate even more sophisticated approaches to maintaining crew safety in the face of potential decompression events. The engineering solutions continue evolving as our understanding deepens. Personal rescue spheres, essentially inflatable life rafts for space, provide crew members with emergency refuges that can maintain pressure and atmosphere during spacecraft emergencies. These devices represent practical applications of vacuum survival research, designed to bridge the critical gap between catastrophic pressure loss and rescue or repair operations. Perhaps most remarkably, the study of human survival in vacuum conditions has revealed that the boundary between the possible and impossible is often narrower and more nuanced than we initially assumed. The difference between survival and death in a vacuum exposure can be measured in seconds, yet those seconds represent genuine opportunities for rescue and recovery. This knowledge transforms vacuum exposure from an abstract death sentence into a specific medical emergency with defined timeframes and treatment protocols. The research continues as we prepare for an era of expanded human presence in space. New questions emerge about long-term effects of repeated pressure cycling, individual variations in vacuum tolerance, and optimal approaches to emergency response in space environments. Each mission, each accident, and each survival story adds to our understanding of how human biology responds to the most extreme environment our species has yet encountered. The temperature dynamics of vacuum exposure reveal another fascinating aspect of how our bodies respond to extreme conditions. While science fiction often portrays instant freezing in space, the reality involves a much more gradual cooling process. Vacuum is actually an excellent insulator, because it contains no matter to conduct heat away from the body. In space, heat loss occurs primarily through radiation, a relatively slow process that would take hours to significantly lower core body temperature. However, the localized cooling from water evaporation creates a complex thermal environment within the body. The mouth, nasal passages, and respiratory tract cool rapidly to near freezing temperatures due to continuous water vapor loss, while the body's core temperature remains relatively stable for extended periods. This temperature gradient creates unique physiological stresses as some tissues experience near freezing conditions, while others maintain normal temperatures. The evaporative cooling effect demonstrates principles that apply far beyond vacuum exposure. The same physics that rapidly cools the mouth and lungs in vacuum conditions governs evaporative cooling systems, perspiration effectiveness, and even some industrial processes. Understanding how water phase transitions affect heat transfer in biological systems has applications ranging from medical hypothermia treatments to spacecraft thermal management systems. Blood circulation during vacuum exposure presents another area where research has revealed surprising complexity. While vapor bubble formation disrupts normal circulation patterns, the heart typically continues beating for a significant period after vacuum exposure begins. The cardiovascular system's response involves attempting to maintain blood pressure and circulation despite the presence of vapor bubbles throughout the circulatory network. This response pattern has informed understanding of how circulation systems respond to various forms of disruption beyond just vacuum exposure. The recovery process following repressurization demonstrates remarkable biological resilience. Within moments of pressure restoration, vapor bubbles throughout the body begin redissolving into tissues and bloodstream. The swelling that may have doubled body volume reverses as water vapor condenses back to liquid form. Normal circulation gradually resumes as vapor locks clear from blood vessels. Most remarkably, consciousness typically returns within minutes, suggesting that neural tissues can recover quickly from brief periods of severe oxygen deprivation. This recovery capability has parallels in other medical conditions involving temporary disruption of normal physiology. The mechanisms that allow brain function to resume after vacuum-induced unconsciousness share similarities with recovery patterns observed in various cardiac arrest scenarios, drowning incidents, and other emergencies involving oxygen interruption. The research has contributed to broader medical understanding of resuscitation timelines and recovery potential in various life-threatening situations. The study of individual variation in vacuum tolerance has revealed that survival times and severity of symptoms can vary significantly between individuals. Factors such as physical fitness, age, body composition, and even genetic variations in oxygen transport efficiency appear to influence how long someone might survive vacuum exposure. This variation means that the 90-second survival threshold should be viewed as a general guideline rather than a precise limit applicable to every individual. Understanding these individual differences has practical implications for astronaut selection, training, and emergency procedures. Space agencies now consider physiological factors that might influence vacuum tolerance as part of medical evaluations for space mission candidates. Training programs include education about vacuum exposure effects and decision-making under extreme time pressure, recognizing that crew members might have only seconds to respond to decompression emergencies. The psychological preparation for potential vacuum exposure represents another area where research findings have influenced space mission protocols. Knowing that consciousness persists for several seconds during decompression allows for training procedures that could enable crew members to take life-saving actions during the critical initial moments of a decompression emergency. This training must balance the need for preparedness with avoiding unnecessary anxiety about low-probability but high-consequence events. Modern space missions incorporate multiple layers of protection against vacuum exposure, reflecting decades of accumulated knowledge about the risks and consequences. Primary pressure barriers maintain normal atmospheric conditions within spacecraft and spacesuits. Secondary systems provide backup pressure sources and emergency atmosphere supplies. Tertiary protection includes emergency garments and rescue equipment designed to maintain crew survival during the critical minutes required for rescue operations. The evolution of these protection systems shows how scientific understanding translates into practical engineering solutions. Early spacesuits were essentially individual spacecraft, completely enclosing astronauts in pressurized environments. Modern designs achieve greater efficiency and mobility while maintaining safety through advanced materials, improved joint designs, and sophisticated life support systems that can maintain protection even if primary systems fail. Emergency response protocols for vacuum exposure reflect the time-critical nature of these emergencies. Procedures emphasize immediate recognition of decompression events, rapid deployment of emergency equipment, and coordinated response actions that must occur within the narrow survival window. These protocols are regularly practiced and updated as new knowledge emerges from ongoing research and operational experience. The research into vacuum exposure effects has also contributed to understanding extreme environment physiology more broadly. The mechanisms that govern human survival in vacuum conditions share similarities with responses to other extreme environments, including high altitude, deep sea conditions, and various toxic atmosphere scenarios. This cross-pollination of knowledge has enhanced safety protocols and emergency procedures across multiple fields involving human exposure to hostile environments. Looking toward future space exploration, the lessons learned from vacuum exposure research will become increasingly important as humans venture further from Earth and spend longer periods in space environments. Mars missions lasting years will require a robust understanding of pressure system reliability and emergency response procedures. Lunar bases and orbital facilities housing larger populations will need sophisticated approaches to managing decompression risks while maintaining operational capability. The materials science implications of vacuum exposure research continue evolving as new technologies emerge. Advanced fabrics that can provide mechanical counterpressure, smart materials that respond automatically to pressure changes, and even biological approaches to enhancing human vacuum tolerance represent areas of ongoing investigation. These developments could eventually lead to lighter, more flexible, and more reliable protection systems for space operations. The fundamental question of human limits in extreme environments extends beyond just survival to encompass questions of performance, comfort, and long-term health effects. While research has established basic survival parameters for vacuum exposure, less is known about subtler effects such as how repeated exposure to reduced pressure conditions might affect human health over time, or how psychological factors influence physiological responses to extreme environmental stress. As we continue expanding human presence beyond Earth's protective atmosphere, the knowledge gained from studying vacuum exposure effects provides a central foundation for keeping explorers safe while pushing the boundaries of human capability. The research transforms what was once purely theoretical speculation into practical knowledge that could preserve life in the most extreme environment humans have yet encountered. This brings us to explore how these fundamental challenges of human survival in vacuum connect to the broader questions of how life adapts and persists in the most extreme environments our universe can present.